So, hi, welcome back. This is Paper Cuts. Oh man, I still need to work on that, on the intro for this show. I have a spot I have planned. But anyway, welcome back. We're going to be reading The War of the Worlds. Give me a moment to finish pulling it up on my book reader here, because I actually got my ducks in a row and put it on my Kindle, because that's a thing that exists. Ebooks, they're a real thing. Alright, so last we left off in chapter 14. We were learning about the narrator's brother who was in London as this all was going down. And now here we are with chapter 15. Chapter 15. What happened in Surrey. It was while the curate had sat and talked so wildly to me under the hedge in the flat meadows near Halliford, and while my brother was watching the fugitives stream over Westminster Bridge, that the Martians had resumed the offensive. So far as one can ascertain from the conflicting accounts that have been put forth, the majority of them remained busied with preparations in the Horsell pit until 9 that night, hurrying on some operation that disengaged huge volumes of green smoke. But 3 certainly came out about 8 o'clock, and, advancing slowly and cautiously, made their way through Byfleet and Pierford towards Ripley and Weybridge, and so came in sight of the expectant batteries against the setting sun. These Martians did not advance in a body, but in a line, each perhaps a mile and a half from his nearest fellow. They communicated with one another by means of siren-like howls, running up and down the scale from one note to another. It was at this howling and firing of the guns at Ripley and St. George's Hill that we heard at... It was this howling and firing of the guns at Ripley and St. George's Hill that we had heard at Upper Halliford. The Ripley gunners, unseasoned artillery volunteers who ought never have been placed in such a position, fired one wild, premature, ineffectual volley, and bolted on horse and foot through the deserted village, while the Martian, without using his heat ray, walked serenely over the guns, stepped gingerly among them, passed in front of them, and so came unexpectedly upon the guns in Painshill Park, which he destroyed. The St. George's Hill men, however, were better led or of a better mettle. Hidden by a pine wood as they were, they seemed to have been quite unsuspected by the Martian nearest to them. They laid their guns as deliberately as if they had been on parade, and fired at almost 1,000 yards range. The shells flashed all around him, and he was seen to advance a few paces, stagger, and go down. Everybody yelled together, and the guns were reloaded in a frantic haste. The overthrown Martian set up a prolonged undulation, and immediately a second glittering giant, answering him, appeared over the trees to the south. It would seem that a leg of the tripod had been smashed by one of the shells. The whole of the second volley flew wide of the Martian on the ground, and simultaneously both his companions brought their heat rays to bear on the battery. The ammunition blew up, the pine trees all about the guns flashed into fire, and only 1 or 2 of the men who were already running over the crest of the hill had escaped. After this, it would seem that the 3 took counsel together and halted, and the scouts who were watching them report that they remained absolutely stationary for the next half hour. The Martian who had been overthrown crawled tediously out of his hood, a small brown figure, oddly suggestive from that distance of a speck of blight, and apparently engaged in the repair of his support. About 9 he had finished, for his cowl was then seen above the trees again. It was a few minutes past 9 that night when these 3 sentinels were joined by 4 other Martians, each carrying a thick black tube. A similar tube was handed to each of the 3, and the 7 proceeded to distribute themselves at equal distances along a curved line between St. George's Hill, Weybridge, and the village of Send, southwest of Ripley. A dozen rockets sprang out of the hills before them so soon as they began to move, and warned the waiting batteries about Ditton and Esher. At the same time, 4 of their fighting machines, similarly armed with tubes, crossed the river, and 2 of them, black against the western sky, came into sight of myself and the curate as we hurried wearily and painfully along the road that runs northward out of Halliford. They moved, as it seemed to us, upon a cloud, for a milky mist covered the fields and rose to a third of their height. At this sight, the curate cried faintly in his throat and began running, but I knew it was no good running from a Martian, and I turned aside and crawled through dewy nettles and brambles into the road ditch by the side of the road. He looked back, saw what I was doing, and turned to join me. The two halted, the nearer to us standing and facing Sunbury, the remoter being a gray indistinctness towards the evening star, away towards Staines. The occasional howling of the Martians had ceased. They took up their positions in the huge crescent about their cylinders in absolute silence. It was a crescent with 12 miles between its horns. Never since the devising of gunpowder was the beginning of a battle so still. To us and to an observer about Ripley, it would have had precisely the same effect. The Martians seemed in solitary possession of the darkling night, lit only as it was by the slender moon, the stars, the afterglow of the daylight, and the ruddy glare from St. George's Hill and the woods of Painshill. But facing that crescent everywhere, at Staines, Hounslow, Ditton, Esher, Ockham, behind hills and woods south of the river, and across the flat grass meadows to the north of it, wherever a cluster of trees or village houses gave sufficient cover, the guns were waiting. The signal rockets burst and rained their sparks through the night and vanished, and the spirit of all those watching batteries rose to a tense expectation. The Martians had but to advance into the line of fire, and instantly those motionless black forms of men, those guns glittering so darkly in the early night, would explode into a thunderous fury of battle. No doubt the thought that was uppermost in the thousand of these vigilant minds, even as it was uppermost in mine, was the riddle. How much they understood of us. Did they grasp that we and our millions were organized, disciplined, working together? Or did they interpret our spurts of fire, the sudden stinging of our shells, our steady investment of their encampment, as we should the furious unanimity of an onslaught in a disturbed hive of bees? Did they dream they might exterminate us? At that time, no one knew what food they needed. 100 such questions struggled together in my mind as I watched that vast sentinel shape. And in the back of my mind was the sense of all the huge unknown and hidden forces Londonward. Had they prepared pitfalls? Were the powder mills at Hounslow ready as a snare? Would the Londoners have the heart and courage to make a greater Moscow of their mighty province of houses? Then, after an indeterminable time, it seemed to us, crouching and peering through the hedge, came a sound like the distant concussion of a gun. Another nearer, and then another. And then the Martian beside us raised his tube on high and discharged it, gun-wise, with a heavy report that made the ground heave. The one toward Staines answered him. There was no flash, no smoke, simply that loaded detonation. I was so excited by these heavy-minute guns following one another that I so far forgot my personal safety and scalded hands as to clamber up into the hedge and stare towards Sunbury. As I did so, a second report followed, and a big projectile hurtled overhead towards Hounslow. I expected at least to see smoke or fire, or some such evidence of its work. But all I saw was the deep blue sky above, with one solitary star, and the white mist spreading wide and low beneath. And there had been no crash, no answering explosion. The silence was restored. The minute lengthened to 3. What has happened? Said the curate, standing up beside me. Heaven knows, said I. A bat flickered by and vanished. A distant tumult of shouting began and ceased. I looked again at the Martian and saw he was now moving eastward along the river bank with a swift rolling motion. Every moment I expected the fire of some hidden battery to spring upon him, but the evening calm was unbroken. The figure of the Martian grew smaller as he receded, and presently the mist and gathering night had swallowed him up. By a common impulse, we clambered higher. Towards Sunbury was a dark appearance, as though a conical hill had suddenly come into being there, hiding our view of the farther country, and then remoter across the river, over Welton, we saw another such summit. These hill-like forms grew lower and broader even as we stared. Moved by a sudden thought, I looked northward, and there I perceived a third of these cloudy black kopjes had risen. Everything had suddenly become very still. Far away to the southeast, marking the quiet, We heard the Martians hooting to one another, and then the air quivered again with the distant thud of their guns. But the earthly artillery made no reply. Now, at the time, we didn't understand these things, but I was later to learn the meaning of these ominous kopjes that had gathered in the twilight. Each of the Martians standing in the great crescent I have described had discharged, by means of the gun-like tube he carried, a huge canister over whatever hill, copse, cluster of houses, or other possible cover for guns chanced to be in front of him. Some fired only one of these, some two. As in the case of the one we had seen, the one at Ripley is said to have discharged no fewer than 5 at the time. These canisters smashed on striking the ground. They didn't explode, and incontinently disengaged an enormous volume of heavy, inky vapor, coiling and pouring upward in a huge and ebony cumulus cloud, a gaseous hill that sank and spread itself over the surrounding country. And with the touch of that vapor, the inhaling of its pungent wisps was death to all that breathes. It was heavy, this vapor, heavier than the densest smoke, so that after the first tumultuous uprush and outflow of its impact, it sank down through the air and poured over the ground in a manner rather liquid than gaseous, abandoning the hills and streaming into the valleys and ditches and watercourses, even as I have heard the carbonic acid gas that pours from volcanic clefts is wont to do. And where it came upon the water, some chemical action occurred, and the surface would be instantly covered with a powdery scum that sank slowly and made way for more. The scum was absolutely insoluble, and it is a strange thing, seeing the instant effect of the gas, that one would drink without hurt the water from which it had strained. The vapor did not diffuse as a true gas would do. Instead, it held together in banks, flowing sluggishly down the slope of the land and driving reluctantly before the wind, and very slowly it combined with the mist and moisture of the air, and sank to the earth in that form of dust. Save that an unknown element giving a group of 4 lines in the blue of the spectrum is concerned, we are still entirely ignorant of the nature of this substance. Once the tumultuous upheaval of its dispersion was over, the black smoke clung so closely to the ground, even before its precipitation, that 50 feet up in the air, on the roofs and upper stories of high houses and on great trees, there was a chance of escaping its poison altogether, as was proved even that night at Street Cobhammen didn't. The man who escaped at the former place tells a wonderful story of the strangeness of its coiling flow, and how he looked down from the church spire and saw the houses of the village rising like ghosts out of its inky nothingness. For a day and a half he remained there, weary, starving, and sun-scorched. The earth under the blue sky, and against the prospect of the distant hills, a velvet-black expanse, with red roofs, green trees, and later, black-veiled shrubs and gates, barns, outhouses, and walls, rising here and there into the sunlight. But that was at Street Cobham, where the black vapor was allowed to remain until it sank of its own accord into the ground. As a rule, the Martians, when it had served its purpose, cleared the air of it again by wading into it and directing a jet of steam upon it. This they did with the vapor banks near us, as we saw in the starlight from the window of a deserted house at Upper Halliford, whither we had returned. From there we could see the searchlights on Richmond Hill and Kingston Hill going 2 and 4, and about 11 the windows rattled, and we heard the sound of the huge siege guns that had been put in position there. These continued intermittently for the pace of a quarter of an hour, sending chance shots at the invisible Martians at Hampton and Ditton, and then the pale beams of the electric light vanished, and were replaced by a bright red glow. Then the 4th cylinder fell, a brilliant green meteor, as I learned afterwards, in Bushy Park. Before the guns on the Richmond and Kingston line of hills began, there was a fitful cannonade, far away in the southwest, due, I believe, to guns being fired haphazardly before the black vapor could overwhelm the gunners. So, setting about it as methodically as men might smoke out a wasp's nest, the Martians spread this strange, stifling vapor over the Londonward country. The horns of the crescent slowly moved apart, until at last they formed a line from Hanwell to Coombe and Maiden. All night through their destructive tubes advanced. Never once, after the Martian at St. George's Hill was brought down, did they give the artillery the ghost of a chance against them. Wherever there was a possibility of guns being laid for them unseen, a fresh canister of the black vapor was discharged, and where the guns were openly displayed, the heat ray was brought to bear. By midnight, the blazing trees along the slopes of Richmond Park and the glare of Kingston Hill threw their light upon a network of black smoke, blotting out the whole valley of the Thames and extending as far as the eye could reach. And through this, 2 Martians slowly waded and turned their hissing steam jets this way and that. They were sparing the heat ray that night, either because they had but a limited supply of material for its production, or because they did not wish to destroy the country, but only to crush and overawe the opposition they aroused. In the latter aim, they certainly succeeded. Saturday night was the end of the organized opposition to their movements. After that, no body of men would stand against them, so hopeless was the enterprise. Even the crews of the torpedo boats and destroyers that had brought up their quick fires up the Thames refused to stop, mutinied, and then went down again. The only offensive operation men ventured upon after that night was the preparation of mines and pitfalls, and in even that, their energies were frantic and spasmodic. One has to imagine as well as one may the fate of those batteries towards Esher, waiting so tensely in the twilight. Survivors there were none. One may picture the orderly expectation, the officers alert and watchful, the gunners ready, the ammunition piled to hand, the limber gunners with their horses and wagons, the groups of civilian spectators standing as near as they were permitted, the evening stillness, the ambulances and hospital tents with the burned and wounded from Weybridge, and then the dull resonance of the shots the Martians fired, and the clumsy projectile whirling over the trees and houses and smashing amid the neighboring fields. One may picture, too, the sudden shifting of attention, the swiftly spreading coils and bellyings of that blackness advancing headlong, towering heavenward, turning the twilight to a palpable darkness, a strange and horrible antagonist of vapor, striding upon its victims, men and horses near it seen dimly, running, shrieking, falling headlong, shouts of dismay, the guns suddenly abandoned, men choking and writhing on the ground, and the swift broadening out of the opaque cone of smoke. And then night and extinction, nothing but a silent mass of impenetrable vapor, hiding its dead. Before the dawn, the black vapor was pouring through the streets of Richmond, and the disintegrating organism of government was, with a last expiring effort, rousing the population of London to the necessity of flight. You must excuse me, I have to take a short moment of a break between each chapter, drink some water, occasionally have a stretch, you know. I'll do my best not to drink too loudly on air. I know I have a very loud, obnoxious gulping sound that accompanies me trying to drink anything. It's why I avoid drinking on camera for YouTube as well. So, now that I've had my water, let's get to chapter 16. The Exodus from London. So you understand the roaring wave of fear that swept through the greatest city in the world just as Monday was dawning, the stream of flight rising swiftly to a torrent, lashing in the foaming tumult around the railway stations, banked up into a horrible struggle about the shipping in the Thames, and hurrying by every available channel northward and eastward. By 10 o'clock, the police organization, and by midday even the railway organizations, were losing coherency, losing shape and efficiency, guttering, softening, running at last in that swift liquefaction of the social body. All the railway lines north of the Thames and the southeastern people at Cannon Street had been warned by midnight on Sunday, and trains were being filled. People were fighting savagely for standing room in the carriages, even at 2 o'clock. By 3, people were being trampled and crushed, even in Bishopsgate Street, a couple hundred yards or more from the Liverpool Street station. Revolvers were fired, people stabbed, and the policemen who had been sent to direct the traffic, exhausted and infuriated, were breaking the heads of people they were called out to protect. And as the day advanced and the engine drivers and the stokers refused to return to London, the pressure of the flight drove the people in an ever-thickening multitude away from the stations and along the northward running roads. By midday, a Martian had been seen at Barnes, and a cloud of slowly sinking black vapor drove along the Thames and across the flats of Lambeth, cutting off all escape over the bridges in its sluggish advance. Another bank drove over Ealing and surrounded a little island of survivors on Castle Hill, alive but unable to escape. After a fruitless struggle to get aboard a northwestern train at Chalk Farm, the engines of the trains that had loaded in the goods yard were plowed through shrieking people, and a dozen stalwart men fought to keep the crowd from crushing the driver against his furnace. My brother emerged upon the Chalk Farm road, dodged through a hurrying storm of vehicles, and had the luck to be foremost in the sack of a cycle shop. The front tire of the machine he got was punctured and dragging it through the window, but he got up and off, notwithstanding, with no further injury than a cut wrist. The steep foot of Haverstock Hill was impassable owing to several overturned horses, and my brother got stuck into Belsize Road. So he got out of the fury of the panic and, skirting the Edgware Road, reached Edgware about 7, fasting and wearied, but well ahead of the crowd. Along the road, people were standing in the roadway, curious and wondering. He was passed by a number of cyclists, some horsemen, and 2 motor cars. A mile from Edgware, the rim of the wheel broke, and the machine became unrideable. He left it by the roadside and trudged through the village. There were shops, half opened in the main street of the place, and people crowded on the pavement and in the doorways and in the windows, staring astonished at this extraordinary progression of fugitives that was the beginning. He succeeded in getting some food at an inn. For a time he remained in Edgware, not knowing what next to do. The flying people increased in slumber. Many of them, like my brother, seemed inclined to loiter in the place. There was no fresh news of the invaders from Mars, after all. At that time the road was crowded, but as yet far from congested. Most of the fugitives at that hour were mounted on cycles, but there were soon motor cars, hansom cabs, and carriages hurrying along, and the dust hung in heavy clouds along the road to St. Albans. It was perhaps a vague idea of making his way to Chelmsford, where some of his friends lived, and that at least induced my brother to strike onto a quiet lane running eastward. Presently he came upon a stile, and crossing it, followed a footpath northeastward. He passed near several farmhouses and a few little places whose names he did not learn. He saw few fugitives until, in a grassed lane towards High Barnet, he happened upon 2 ladies who became his fellow travelers. He came upon them just in time to save them as well. He heard their screams, and hurrying round the corner, saw a couple of men struggling to drag them out of the little pony chaise in which they had been driving, while a third with difficulty held the frightened pony's head. One of the ladies, a short woman dressed in white, was simply screaming. The other, a dark, slender figure, slashed at the man, who gripped her arm with a whip she held in her disengaged hand. My brother immediately grasped the situation, shouted, and hurried towards the struggle. One of the men desisted and turned towards him, and my brother, realizing from his antagonist's face that a fight was unavoidable, and being an expert boxer, went into him forthwith and set him down against the wheel of the chaise. It was no time for pugilistic chivalry, and my brother laid him quiet with a kick, and gripped the collar of the man who pulled the slender lady's arm. He heard the clatter of hooves, the whip stung across his face, and a third antagonist struck him between the eyes, and the man he held wrenched himself free, and made off down the lane, in the direction from which he had come. Partly stunned, he found himself facing the man who had held the horse's head, and became aware of the chaise receding from him down the lane, swaying from side to side, and with the woman in it looking back. The man before him, a burly rough, tried to close, and he stopped him with a blow in the face. Then, realizing that he was deserted, He dodged round and made off down the lane after the chaise, with the sturdy man close behind him, and the fugitive, who had turned now, following remotely. Suddenly he stumbled and fell. His immediate pursuer went headlong, and he rose to his feet to find himself with a couple of antagonists again. He would have had little chance against them had not the slender lady very pluckily rolled up and returned to his help. It seems like she had a revolver all this time, but it had been under the seat when she and her companion were attacked. She fired at 6 yards' distance, narrowly missing my brother. The less courageous of the robbers made off, and his companion followed him, cursing his cowardice. They both stopped in sight down the lane, where the third man lay insensible. "Take this," said the slender lady, and she gave my brother her revolver. "Go back to the chase," said my brother, wiping the blood from his split lip. She turned without a word. They were both panting, and they went back to where the lady in white struggled to hold back the frightened pony. The robbers had evidently had enough of it. When my brother looked again, they were retreating. "I'll sit here, if I may," said my brother, and he got down upon the front empty seat. The lady looked over her shoulder. "Give me the reins," she said, and laid the whip along the pony's side. In another moment, a bend in the road hid the three men from my brother's eyes. So, quite unexpectedly, my brother found himself, panting, with a cut mouth, a bruised jaw, and blood-stained knuckles, driving along an unknown lane with these two women. He learned that they were the wife and younger sister of a surgeon living at Stanmore, who had come in the small hours from a dangerous case at Pinner, and had heard at some railway station on his way of the Martian advance. He hurried home, roused the women, their servant had left them 2 days before, packed some provisions, put his revolver under the seat, luckily for my brother, and told them to drive on to Edgware, with the idea of getting a train there. He stopped behind to tell the neighbors. He would overtake them, he said, and at about 4:30 in the morning, and now it was nearly 9, and they had seen nothing of him. They could not stop in Edgware because of the growing traffic through the place, however, so they had come into the side lane. That was the story they told my brother in fragments when presently they stopped again, nearer to New Barnet. He promised to stay with them, at least until they could determine what to do, or until the missing man arrived, and professed to be an expert shot with a revolver, a weapon strange to him, in order to give them confidence. They made a sort of encampment by the wayside, and the pony became happy in the hedge. He told them of his own escape out of London, and all that he knew in those Martians and their ways. The sun crept higher in the sky, and after a time their talk died out and gave place to an uneasy state of anticipation. Several wayfarers came along the lane, and of these my brother gathered such news as he could. Every broken answer he had deepened his impression of the great disaster that had come to humanity, deepened his persuasion of the immediate necessity for prosecuting this flight. He urged the matter upon them. "We have money," said the slender woman, and hesitated. Her eyes met my brother's, and her hesitation ended. "So have I," said my brother. She explained that they had as much as £30 in gold, besides the £5 note, and suggested that with that they might get upon a train at St. Albans or New Burnett. My brother thought that this was hopeless, seeking the fury of the Londoners to crowd upon the trains, and broached his own idea of striking across Essex towards Harwich, and thence escaping from the country altogether. Miss Elphinstone, that was the name of the woman in white, would listen to no reasoning, and kept calling upon George, but her sister-in-law was astonishingly quiet and deliberate, and at last agreed to my brother's suggestion. So, designing to cross the Great North Road, they went on towards Barnet, my brother leading the pony to save it as much as possible. As the sun crept up the sky, the day became excessively hot, and underfoot a thick whitish sand grew burning and blinding, so that they traveled only very slowly. The hedges were gray with dust, and so they advanced towards Barnet. The tumultuous muttering grew stronger. There they began to meet new people. For the most part, these were staring before them, murmuring indistinct questions, jaded, haggard, and unclean. One man in evening dress passed them on foot, his eyes on the ground. They heard his voice, and looking back at him, saw one hand clutched in his hair and the other beating invisible things. His paroxysm of rage over, he went on his way without once looking back. As my brother's party went on towards the crossroads to the south of Barnet, they saw a woman approaching the child across some fields on their left, carrying a child with... Sorry, I misread something. As my brother's party went on towards the crossroads to the south of Barnet, they saw a woman approaching the road across some fields on their left, carrying a child and with two other children, and then passed a man in dirty black, with a thick stick in one hand and a small portmanteau in another. Then round the corner of the lane, from between the villas that guarded it at its confluence with the high road, came a little cart, drawn by a sweating black pony and driven by a sallow girl in a bowler hat, gray with dust. There were 3 girls, East End factory girls, and a couple of little children crowded in the cart. "This take us round Edgware?" asked the driver, wild-eyed and white-faced. And when my brother told him it would if he turned to the left, he whipped it up at once, without the formality of thanks. My brother noticed a pale gray smoke or haze rising among the houses in front of them and veiling the white facade of a terrace beyond the road that appeared between the backs of villas. Miss Elphinstone suddenly cried out at a number of tongues of smoky red flame leaping up above the houses in front of them against the hot blue sky. The tumultuous noise resolved itself now into the disorderly mingling of many voices, the grind of many wheels, the creaking of wagons, and the staccato of hooves. The lane came round sharply, not 50 yards from the crossroads. "Good heavens!" cried Miss Elphinstone. "What is this you're driving us into?" My brother stopped. For the main road was a boiling stream of people, a torrent of human beings pushing northward, one pressing on another. A great bank of dust, white and luminous in the blaze of the sun, made everything within 20 feet of the ground gray and indistinct, and was perpetually renewed by the hurrying feet of a dense crowd of horses and men and the women on foot, and by the wheels of the vehicles of every description. "Way!" my brother heard voices crying. "Make way!" It was like riding into the smoke of a fire to approach the meeting point of the lane and road. The crowd roared like a fire, and the dust itself was hot and pungent. And indeed, a little way up the road, a villa was burning and sending rolling masses of black smoke across the road to add to the confusion. 2 men came past them, then a dirty woman carrying a heavy bundle and weeping. A lost retriever dog with hanging tongue circled dubiously round them, scared and wretched, and fled at my brother's threat. So much as they could see of the road Londonward, between the houses to the right, it was a tumultuous stream of dirty, hurrying people. Pent in between the villas on either side, the black heads, the crowded forms, grew into distinctiveness as they rushed past their corner, hurried past, and merged their individuality again in a receding multitude that was swallowed up, at least in a cloud of dust. Go on," cried the voices. "Way, way!" One man's hand pressed on the back of another. My brother stared at the pony's head, and inexplicably attracted, he advanced slowly, pace by pace, down the lane. Edgware had been a scene of confusion, chalk farm a riotous tumult, but this was a whole population in movement. It's hard to imagine that host. There was no character of its own. The figures poured out past the corner and receded with their backs to the group in the lane. Along with the margin came those who were on foot, threatened by the wheels, stumbling in ditches, blundering into one another. The carts and carriages crowded close upon one another, making little way for those swifter and more impatient vehicles that darted forward every now and then when an opportunity showed itself of doing so, sending the people scattering against the fences and gates of the walls. "Push on," was the cry. "Push on, they are coming." In one cart stood a blind man in the uniform of the Salvation Army, gesticulating with a crooked finger and bawling, "Eternity! Eternity!" His voice was hoarse and very loud, so that my brother could have heard him after he was lost to sight in the dust. Well, if his voice is hoarse and very loud, we need to reread that line. "Eternity! Eternity!" Some of the people who crowded in the carts whipped stupidly at their horses and quarreled with other drivers. Some sat motionless, staring at nothing with miserable eyes, and some gnawed at their hands with thirst, or lay prostrate in the bottom of their conveyances. The horses' bits were covered with foam, their eyes bloodshot. There were cabs, carriages, shop cars, wagons, beyond counting, a mail cart, a road cleaner's cart marked Vestry of St. Pancras, a huge timber wagon crowded with roughs. A brewer's dray rumbled by with its two near wheels splashed with fresh blood. "Clear the way!" cried the voices. "Clear the way!" "Eternity! Eternity!" came echoing down the road. There were sad, haggard women trampling by, well-dressed, with children that cried and stumbled, their dainty clothes smothered in dust, their weary faces smeared with tears. With many of these men, sometimes helpful, sometimes lowering and savage. Fighting side by side with them pushed some weary street outcast in a faded black rags, wide-eyed, loud-mouthed, and foul-voiced. There were sturdy workmen thrusting their way along, wretched, unkempt men, clothed like clerks or shopmen, struggling spasmodically. A wounded soldier, my brother noticed, men dressed in the clothes of railway porters. One wretched creature in a nightshirt with a coat thrown over it. But as varied as the composition was, certain things all that host had in common. There was fear and pain on their faces, and fear behind them. A tumult up the road, a quarrel for a place in a wagon, sent the whole host of them quickening their pace. Even a man so scared and broken that his knees bent under him was galvanized for a moment into renewed activity. The heat and dust had already been at work upon this multitude. Oh dear, I seem to have lost my place. Well, that's annoying. The heat and dust had already been at work upon this multitude. Their skins were dry, their lips black and cracked. They were all thirsty, weary, and footsore. And amid the various cries one heard disputes, reproaches, groans of weariness and fatigue. The voices of most of them were hoarse and weak. Through it all ran a refrain, "Way, way! The Martians are coming!" Few stopped and came aside from that flood. The lane opened slantingly into the main road with a narrow opening, and had a delusive appearance of coming from the direction of London. Yet a kind of eddy of people drove into its mouth. Weaklings elbowed out of the stream, who for the most part rested but a moment before plunging into it again. A little way down the lane, with two friends bending over him, lay a man with a bare leg, wrapped about with bloody rags. He was a lucky man to have friends in this sort of time. A little old man with a gray military mustache and a filthy black frock coat limped out and sat down beside the trap, removed his boot, his sock was blood-stained, shook out a pebble and hobbled on again. And then a little girl of 8 or 9, all alone, threw herself under the hedge close by my brother, weeping. I can't go on. My brother woke from his torpor of astonishment and lifted her up, speaking gently to her, and carried her to Miss Elphinstone. As soon as my brother touched her, she became quite still, as if frightened. "Ellen!" shrieked a woman in the crowd, with tears in her eyes. "Ellen!" And the child suddenly darted away from my brother, crying, "Mother!" "They're coming," said a man on horseback, riding along the lane. "Out of the way there!" bawled the coachman, towering high, and my brother saw a closed carriage turning into the lane. The people crushed back on one another to avoid the horse. My brother pushed the pony and chaise back into the hedge, and the man drove by and stopped at the turn of the way. It was a carriage with a pole for a pair of horses, but only one was in the traces. My brother saw dimly through the dust that the two men lifted out something on a white stretcher and put it gently on the grass beneath the privet hedge. One of the men came running to my brother. "Where is there any water?" he said. "He's dying fast and very thirsty. It's Lord Garrick." "Lord Garrick?" said my brother. "The Chief Justice?" "The water? This may be a trap," I said to my brother. "In some of the houses, we really don't know if we have that much water. I dare not leave my people, however." The man pushed against the crowd towards the gate of the corner house. "Go on," said the people, thrusting at him. "They are coming, go on." Then my brother's attention was distracted by a bearded, eagle-faced man hugging a small handbag, which split even as my brother's eyes rested on it. You must excuse me, I didn't get that much sleep last night. I really need to remember to sleep. But as I was saying, the eagle-faced man lugging a small handbag, which split even as my brother's eyes rested on it, and disgorged a huge mass of sovereigns that seemed to break up into separate coins as it struck the ground. They rolled hither and thither among the struggling feet of men and horses. The man stopped and looked stupidly at the heap, and the shaft of a cab struck his shoulder and sent him reeling. He gave a shriek and dodged back, and a cartwheel shaved him narrowly. "Way!" cried all the men about him. "Make way!" As soon as the cab had passed, he flung himself, with both hands open, upon the heap of coins, and began thrusting handfuls in his pocket. A horse rose close upon him, and in another moment, half rising, he had been borne down under the horse's hooves. "Stop!" screamed my brother, and pushed a woman out of his way, trying to clutch the bit of the horse. Before he could get to it, however, he heard a scream under the wheels, and saw through the dust the rim passing over the poor wretch's back. The poor wretch's back. The driver of the cart slashed his whip at my brother, who ran round the cart behind it. The multitudinous shouting confused his ears. The man was writhing in the dust among his scattered money, unable to rise, for the wheel had broken his back, and his lower limbs lay limp and dead. My brother stood up and yelled at the next driver, and a man on a black horse came to his assistance. "Get him out of the road," said he, and clutching the man's collar with his free hand, my brother lugged him sideways. But still he clutched after his money and regarded my brother fiercely, hammering at his arm with a handful of gold. Go on," shouted the angry voices behind. "Away, away!" There was a smash as the pole of the carriage crashed into the cart that the man on horseback had stopped. My brother looked up, and the man with the gold twisted his head round and bit the wrist that held his collar. There was a concussion, and the black horse came staggering sideways with the cart horse pushed beside it. A hoof missed my brother's foot by a hair's breadth, and he released his grip on the falling man and jumped back. He saw anger change to terror in the face of the poor wretch on the ground, and in a moment he was hidden, and my brother was borne backward and carried past the entrance of the lane, and had to fight hard in the torrent to recover it. He saw Miss Elphinstone covering her eyes, and a little child, with all a child's want of sympathetic imagination, staring with dilated eyes at a dusty something that lay black and still, ground and crushed under the rolling wheels. "Let us go back," he shouted, and began turning the pony around, "We can yet cross this," he said, and they went back 100 yards the way they came, until the fighting crowd was hidden. As they passed the bend in the lane, my brother saw the face of the dying man in the ditch under the privet, deadly white and drawn, and shining with perspiration. The two women sat silent, crouching in their seat and shivering. Then beyond the bend, my brother stopped again. Miss Elphinstone was white and pale, and her sister-in-law sat weeping, too wretched to even call upon George. My brother was horrified and perplexed. As they had retreated, he realized how urgent and unavoidable it was to attempt this crossing. He turned to Miss Elphinstone, suddenly resolute. "We must go this way," he said, and led the pony round again. For the second time that day, this girl proved her quality. To force their way into the torrent of people, my brother plunged into the traffic and held back a cab horse, while she drove the pony across its head. A wagon locked wheels for a moment and ripped a long splinter from the chase. In another moment, they were caught and swept forward by the stream. My brother, with the cabman's whip marks right across his face and hands, scrambled in the chase and took the reins from her. "Point the revolver at the man behind," he said, giving it over to her. If he presses us too hard, no. Point at his horse." Then he began to look out for a chance of edging to the right across the road. But once in the stream, he seemed to lose volition, to become a part of that dusty route. They swept through Chipping Barnet. With the torrent, they were nearly a mile beyond the center of the town before they had fought access to the opposite side of the way. It was din and confusion and indescribable, but in this and beyond, the town folks repeatedly, and to some extent, relieved the stress. They struck eastward through Hadley, and there on either side of the road, and at another place farther upon, they came upon a great multitude of people drinking at the stream, some fighting to come at the water, and farther on, from a lull near East Barnet, they saw two trains running slowly, one after the other, without signal or order, trains swarming with people, with men even among the coals behind the engines, going northward along the Great Northern Railway. My brother supposes that they must have filled outside London, for at that time the furious terror of the people had rendered the central termini impossible. Near this place they halted for the rest of the afternoon, for the violence of the day had already utterly exhausted all three of them. They began to suffer the beginnings of hunger. The night was cold, and none of them dared to sleep. And in the evening many people came hurrying along the road nearby their stopping place rather, and fleeing from unknown dangers before them, they headed in the direction from which my brother had come. Now I'm going to mute the mic for a moment as I need to change the mic stand a bit. But don't worry, don't adjust your radios, folks. We're still live. Well, it turns out I didn't really need to mute the mic, but better safe than sorry. I didn't want to deafen you poor folks with a terrible screech. Some of the mic stands are rather prone to that, to put it nicely. Anyway, now we enter Chapter 17, The Thunder Child. Had the Martians only aimed at destruction, they might on Monday have annihilated the entire population of London, as it spread itself slowly through the home counties. Not only along the road through Barnet, but also through Edgware and Waltham Abbey, and along the roads eastward to Southend and Shoeburyness, and south of the Toms to Deal and Broadstairs, poured the same fanatic route. If one could have hung that June morning in a balloon in the blazing blue above London every northward and eastward road, Running out of the tangled maze of streets would have seemed stippled black with the streaming fugitives, each dot a human agony of terror and physical distress. I've set forth at length in the last chapter my brother's account of the road through Chipping Barnet, in order that my readers may realize how that the swarming of black dots appeared to one of those concerned. Never before in the history of the world had such a mass of human beings moved and suffered together. The legendary hosts of Goths and Huns, the hugest armies that Asia had ever seen, would have been but a drop in that current. And this was no disciplined march, unfortunately. It was a stampede gigantic and terrible, without order and without a goal. 6 million people, unarmed and unprovisioned, driving headlong. It was the beginning of a rout of civilization, of the massacre of mankind. Directly below him, the balloonist would have seen the network of streets far and wide. Houses, churches, squares, crescents, gardens, already derelict, spread out like a huge map, and in the southward blotted. Over Ealing, Richmond, Wimbledon, it would have seemed as if some monstrous pen had flung ink upon the chart. Steadily, incessantly, each black splash grew and spread, shooting out ramifications this way and that, now banking itself against the rising ground, pouring swiftly over a crest into a newfound valley, exactly as if a gout of ink would spread itself across blotting paper. And beyond, over the blue hills that rise southward of the river, the glittering Martians went to and fro, calmly and methodically spreading their poison cloud over this patch of country and then over that, laying it again with their stream jets when it had served its purpose, and taking possession of the conquered country. They do not seem to have aimed at extermination so much as complete demoralization and the destruction of any opposition. They exploded any stores of powder they came upon, cut every telegraph, and wrecked the railways here and there. They were hamstringing mankind. They seemed in no hurry to extend the field of their operations, and that did not come beyond the central part of London all that day. It is possible that a very considerable number of people in London stuck to their houses through Monday morning. Certain it is that many died at home, suffocated by the black smoke. Until about midday, the Pool of London was an astonishing scene. Steamboats and shipping of all sorts lay there, tempted by the enormous sums of money offered by fugitives, and it is said that many who swam out to these vessels were thrust off with boat hooks and drowned. About 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the thinning remnant of a cloud of the black vapor appeared between the arches of Blackfriars Bridge. At that, the pool became a scene of mad confusion, fighting, and collision, and for some time a multitude of boats and barges jammed in the southern arch of the Tower Bridge, and the sailors and lightermen who had to fight savagely against the people who were swarmed upon them from the riverfront. People were actually clambering down the piers of a bridge from above. When an hour later a Martian appeared beyond the clock tower and waded down the river, nothing but wreckage floated above Limehouse. Of the falling of the 5th cylinder I have presently to tell. The 6th star fell at Wimbledon. My brother, keeping watch beside the women in the chase in a meadow, saw the green flash of it far beyond the hills. On Tuesday, the little party, still set upon getting across the sea, made its way through the swarming country towards Colchester. The news that the Martians were now in possession of the whole of London was confirmed. They had been seen at Highgate and even, it was said, at Neasden, but they did not come into my brother's view until the morrow. That day the scattered multitudes began to realize the urgent need of provisions. As they grew hungry, the rights of property ceased to be regarded. Farmers were out to defend their cattle sheds, granaries, and ripening root crops with arms in their hands. A number of people now, like my brother, had their faces eastward, and there were some desperate souls even going back towards London to get food. These were chiefly people from the northern suburbs, whose knowledge of the black smoke came by hearsay. He heard that about half the members of the government had gathered at Birmingham, and that enormous quantities of high explosives were being prepared to be used in automatic mines across the Midland counties. He was also told that the Midland Railway Company had replaced the desertions of the first day's panic, had resumed traffic, and was running northward trains from St. Albans to relieve the congestion of the home counties. There was also a placard in Chipping on Gar announcing that large stores of flour were available in the northern towns and that within 24 hours bread would be distributed among the starving people in the neighborhood. But this intelligence did not deter him from the plan of escape that he had formed, and the three pressed eastward all day, and he heard no more of the bread distribution than this promise. Nor, as a matter of fact, did anyone else hear more of it. That night fell the seventh star, falling upon Primrose Hill. It fell while Miss Elphinstone was watching, for she took that duty alternately with my brother, and she was the one who saw it. On Wednesday, the three fugitives, they had passed through the night in a field of unripe wheat, reached Chelmsford, and there a body of the inhabitants, calling itself the Committee of Public Supply, seized the pony as provisions and would give nothing in exchange for it but the promise of a share for it in the next day. Here there were rumors of Martians at Epping, and news of the destruction of Waltham Abbey powder mills in a vain attempt to blow up one of the invaders. People were watching for Martians here from the church tower. My brother, very luckily for him as it chanced, preferred to push on at once to the coast rather than wait for food, although all three of them were very hungry. By midday they passed through Tillingham, which, strangely enough, seemed to be quite silent and deserted, save for a few furtive plunderers hunting for food. Near Tillingham they suddenly came in sight of the sea and the most amazing crowd of shipping of all sorts that it is possible to imagine. For after the sailors could no longer come to the Thames, they came on to the Essex coast, to Harwich and Walton and Clacton, and afterwards to Foulness and Shoolbury, to bring off the people. They lay in a huge sickle-shaped curve that vanished into mist at last towards the Naze. Close inshore there was a multitude of fishing smacks, English, Scotch, French, Dutch, and Swedish, steam launches from the Thames, yachts, electric boats, and beyond were the ships of large burden, a multitude of filthy colliers, trim merchantmen, cattle ships, passenger boats, petroleum tanks, ocean tramps, an old white transport even, neat white and grey liners from Southampton and Hamburg, and along the blue coast, across the Blackwater, my brother could make out dimly a dense swarm of boats chaffering with the people on the beach, a swarm which also extended up to the Blackwater, almost to Malden. Out of curiosity, what does chaffering mean? Let's find out. Chaffer, haggle about the terms of an agreement or price of something. It's a rather archaic word, but it's a lovely word. About a couple of miles out lay an ironclad, very low in the water, almost to my brother's perception, like a waterlogged ship. This was the ram Thunderchild. It was the only warship in sight, but far away to the right over the smooth surface of the sea, for that day there was a dead calm, lay a serpent of black smoke to mark the next ironclads of the Channel Fleet, which hovered in an extended line, steam up and ready for action. Across the Thames estuary, during the course of the Martian conquest, vigilant and yet powerless to prevent it. At the sight of the sea, Miss Elphinstone, in despite of the assurances of her sister-in-law, gave way to panic. She'd never been out of England before. She'd rather die than trust herself friendliness in a foreign country and so forth. She seemed, poor woman, to imagine that the French and the Martians might prove very similar. She'd been growing increasingly hysterical, fearful, and depressed during the 2 days' journeyings. Her great idea was to return to Stanmore. Things had always been well and safe at Stanmore. They would find George at Stanmore. It was with the greatest difficulty they could get her down to the beach, where presently my brother succeeded in attracting the attention of some men on a paddle steamer from the Thames. They sent a boat and drove a bargain for £36 for the three. The steamer was going, these men said, to Ostend. It was about 2 o'clock when my brother, having paid his fares at the gangway, paired his fares. I mean, I guess he would be pairing fares since there's 3 of them, but regardless, found himself safely aboard the steamboat with his charges. There was food aboard, albeit at exorbitant prices, and the 3 of them contrived to eat a meal on one of the seats forward. There were already a score of passengers aboard, some of whom had expended their last money in securing a passage, but the captain lay off the Blackwater until 5 in the afternoon, picking up passengers until the seated decks were even dangerously crowded. He probably would have remained longer had it not been for the sound of guns that began that hour in the south. As if in answer, the ironclad seaward fired a small gun and hoisted a string of flags, a jet of smoke spraying out of her funnels. Some of the passengers were of the opinion that this firing came from shoeburyness, until it was noticed that it was growing louder. At the same time, far away in the southeast, the masts and upper works of the three ironclads rose one after the other out of the sea beneath clouds of black smoke. But my brother's attention speedily reverted to the distant firing in the south. He fancied he saw a column of smoke rising out of the distant gray haze. The little steamer was already flapping her way eastward of the big crescent of shipping, and the low Essex coast was growing blue and hazy, when a Martian appeared, small and faint in the remote distance, advancing along the muddy coast from the direction of Foulness. At that the captain on the bridge swore at the top of his voice with fear and anger at his own delay, and the paddles seemed infected with terror. Every soul aboard stood at the bulwarks or on the seats of the steamer, and stared at the distant shape, higher than the trees or church towers inland, and advancing with a leisurely parody of a human stride. It was the first Martian that my brother had seen, and he stood, more amazed than terrified, watching this Titan advancing deliberately towards the shipping, wading farther and farther into the water as the coast fell away. Then, far away, beyond the crouch, came another, striding over some stunted trees, and then yet another, still farther off, wading deeply through a shiny mudflat that seemed to hang halfway up between sea and sky. They were all stalking seaward, as if to intercept the escape of the multitudinous vessels that were crowded between Foulness and Naze. In spite of the throbbing exertions of the engines of the little paddle-boat, and the pouring foam that her wheels flung behind her, she receded with terrifying slowness from this ominous advance. Glancing northwestward, my brother saw the large crescent of shipping already writhing with the approaching terror. One ship passing behind another coming round from broadside to end on. Steamships whistling and giving off volumes of steam, sails being let out, launches rushing hither and thither. He was so fascinated by this and by the creeping danger away to the left that he had no eyes for anything seaward, for that matter. And then, in a swift moment of the steamboat, she'd suddenly come round to avoid being run down. It flung him headlong from the seat on which he was standing. There was a shouting all about him, a trampling of feet, and a cheer that seemed to be answered faintly. The steamboat lurched and rolled him over upon his hands. He sprang to his feet and saw to starboard, and not 100 yards from their heeling, pitching boat, a vast iron bulk like the blade of a plow, tearing through the water, tossing it on either side in huge waves of foam that leaped towards the steamer, flinging her paddles helplessly in the air, and then sucking her deck down almost to the waterline. A blast of spray blinded my brother for a moment, but when his eyes were clear again, he saw the monster had passed and was rushing landward. Big iron upperworks rose out of this headlong structure, and from that twin funnels projected and spat a smoking blast shot with fire. It was the torpedo ram Thunderchild, steaming headlong, coming to the rescue of the threatened shipping. Keeping his footing on the heaving deck by clutching the bulwarks, my brother looked past this charging Leviathan at the Martians again, and he saw the three of them now close together, and standing so far out to sea that their tripod supports were almost entirely submerged. Thus sunken and seen in a remote perspective, they appeared far less formidable than the huge iron bulk in whose wake the steamer was pitching so helplessly. It would seem they were regarding this new antagonist with astonishment. To their intelligence, it may be, the giant was even such another as themselves. The Thunderchild fired no gun, but simply drove full speed towards them. It was probably not her firing that enabled her to get so near the enemy as she did. They did not know what to make of her. One shell and they would have sent her to the bottom forthwith with a heat ray. She was steaming at such a pace that in a minute she seemed halfway between the steamboat and the Martians, a diminishing black hulk against the receding horizontal expanse of the Essex coast. Suddenly, the foremost Martian lowered his tube and discharged a canister of the black gas to the ironclad. It hit her larboard side and glanced off in an inky jet that rolled away to seaward, an unfolding torrent of black smoke from which the ironclad drove clear. To the watchers from the steamer, low in the water,
and with the sun in their eyes, it seems as though she was already among the Martians. They saw the gaunt figures separating and rising out of the water as they retreated shoreward, and one of them raised the camera-like generator of the heat ray. He held it pointing obliquely downward, and a bank of steam sprang from the water at its touch. It must have driven through the iron of the ship's side like a white-hot iron rod through paper. A flicker of flame went up through the rising steam, and then the Martians reeled and staggered. In another moment he was cut down, and a great body of water and steam shot high in the air. The guns of the Thunderchild sounded throughout the reek, going off one after the other, and one shot splashed the water high close by the steamer, ricocheted towards the other flying ships to the north, and smashed a smack to matchwood. But no one heeded that very much. At the sight of the Martian's collapse, the captain on the bridge yelled inarticulately, and all the crowding passengers on the steamer's stern shouted together. And then they yelled again, for surging out beyond the white tumult drove something long and black, the flames steaming from its middle parts, its ventilators and funnels spouting fire. She was alive still. The steering gear, it seems, was intact and her engines working. She headed straight for a second Martian, and was within 100 yards of him when the heat ray came to bear. Then, with a violent thud, a blinding flash, her decks, funnels, they leaped upward. The Martian staggered with the violence of its explosion, and in another moment, the flaming wreckage, still driving forward with the impetus of its pace, had struck him and crumpled up like a thing of cardboard. My brother shouted involuntarily, and a boiling tumult of steam hit everything again. "Two!" yelled the captain. Everyone was shouting. The whole steamer from end to end rang with frantic cheering that was taken up first by one and then by all in the crowding multitude of ships and boats that was driving out to sea. The steam hung upon the water for many minutes, hiding the third Martian and the coast altogether. And all this time the boat was paddling steadily out to sea and away from the fight, and when at last the confusion cleared, the drifting bank of black vapor intervened, and nothing of the Thunderchild could be made out, nor could the third Martian be seen. But the ironclads to seaward were now quite close and standing in towards shore, past the steamboat. The little vessel continued to beat its way seaward, and the ironclads proceeded slowly towards the coast, which was still hidden by a marbled bank of vapor, part steam, part black gas, eddying and combining in the strangest way. The fleet of refugees was scattering to the northeast. Several smacks were sailing between the ironclads and the steamboat. After a time, before they reached the sinking cloud bank, the warships turned northward, and then abruptly went about, and passed into the thickening haze of the evening southward. The coast grew faint and at last indistinguishable amid the low banks of clouds that were gathering about the sinking sun. Then suddenly, out of the golden haze of the sunset, came the vibration of guns, and a form of black shadows moving. Everyone struggled to the rail of the steamer and peered into the blinding furnace of the west, but nothing was to be distinguished clearly. A mass of smoke rose slanting and barred the face of the sun. The steamboat throbbed on its way through an indeterminable suspense. The sun sank into the gray clouds, the sky flushed and darkened, and the evening star trembled into sight. It was deep twilight when the captain cried out and pointed. My brother strained his eyes. Something rushed up into the sky out of the grayness, rushed slantingly upward, and very swiftly into the luminous clearness above the clouds in the western sky. Something flat and broad and very large, that swept round in a vast curve, grew smaller, sank slowly, then vanished again into the gray mystery of the night. And as it flew, it rained down darkness upon the land. And so Book 1 draws to a close. I think this is a rather fitting time for me to take a short break, to grab some water, maybe stretch my legs a little bit. I would firmly suggest you do the same. I'm going to play a short spot for everyone, and then we will come back with Book 2, Chapter 1, The Earth Underneath the Martians, Underfoot. See you in a moment.
Hey, brother. Interested in getting involved with the station? Tweet us at The Stinger Radio or shoot us an email at thestingerradio@gmail.com. We're always looking for new student DJs to start their own shows. Here at The Stinger, we're a station by the students, for the students.
In this world I wouldn't do. What if I'm far from home? Oh brother, I will hear you call. What if I lose it all? Oh sister, I will help you out. Oh, if the sky comes falling down.
All right then. Welcome back. I hope everyone had a good minute break. Hopefully everyone's done their stretches, got the blood moving in their legs and all that again. But now we return to the War of the Worlds. We've progressed about 60% of the way through the book, and so we come to Book 2. The Earth Under the Martians. If you're just tuning in, well, this is a pretty good time to get started. Chapter 1, Underfoot. In the first book, I have wandered so much from my own adventures to tell of the experiences of my brother that all through the last 2 chapters, I and the Curate have been lurking in the empty house at Halliford, whether we fled to escape the black smoke. There I will resume. We stopped there all Sunday night, and in the next day, the day of the panic, in a little island of daylight, cut off by the black smoke from the rest of the world. We could do nothing but wait in the aching inactivity during those 2 weary days. My mind was occupied by anxiety for my wife. I figured her at Leatherhead, terrified, in danger, mourning me already as a dead man. I paced the rooms and cried aloud when I thought of how I was cut off from her, of all that might happen to her in my absence. My cousin, I knew, was brave enough for any emergency, but he was not the sort of man to realize danger quickly and to rise promptly. What was needed now was not bravery, but circumspection. My only consolation was to believe that the Martians were moving Londonward and away from her. Such vague anxieties to keep the mind sensitive and painful. I grew very weary and irritable with the curate's perpetual ejaculations. I tired at the sight of his selfish despair. After some ineffectual remonstrance, I kept away from him, staying in a room, evidently a children's schoolroom, containing globes, forms, and copybooks. When he followed me thither, I went to a box room on top of the house, and in order to be alone with my aching mysteries, locked myself in. We were hopelessly hemmed in by the black smoke all that day and the morning of the next. There were signs of people in the next house on Sunday evening, a face at a window and moving lights, and later the slamming of a door. But I do not know who these people were, nor do I know what became of them. We saw nothing of them the next day either. The black smoke drifted slowly riverward all through Monday morning, creeping nearer and nearer to us, driving at last along the roadway outside the house that hid us. A Martian came across the fields about midday, laying the stuff with a jet of superheated steam that hissed against the walls, smashed all the windows it touched, and scalded the curate's hand as he fled out of the front room. When at last we crept across the sodden rooms and looked out again, the country northward was as though a black snowstorm had passed over it. Looking towards the river, we were astonished to see an unaccountable redness mingling with the black of the scorched meadows. For a time, we did not see how this change affected our position, as we saw that we were relieved of our fear of the black smoke. But later I perceived that we were no longer hemmed in, that now we might get away. So soon as I realized that the way of escape was open, my dreams of action returned, but the curate was lethargic and unreasonable. We're safe here. Safe here. I resolved to leave him. Would that I had. Wiser now for the artilleryman's teaching, I sought out food and drink. I found oil and rags for my burns, and I also took a hat and a flannel shirt that I found in one of the bedrooms. When it was clear to him that I meant to go alone, had reconciled myself to going alone, he suddenly roused himself to come. And all being quiet throughout the afternoon, we started, about 5 o'clock, as I should judge, along the blackened road to Sunbury. In Sunbury, and at intervals along the road, were dead bodies lying in contorted attitudes, horses as well as men, overturned carts and luggage, all covered thickly with the black dust. That pall of cindery powder made me think of what I had read of the destruction of Pompeii. We got to Hampton Court without misadventure, our minds full of strange and unfamiliar appearances. And at Hampton Court our eyes were relieved to find a patch of green that had escaped the suffocating drift. We went through Bushy Park, with its deer going to and fro under the chestnuts, and some men and women hurrying in the distance toward Hampton, and so we came to Twickenham. These were the first people we saw. Away across the road, the woods beyond Ham and Petersham were still afire. Twickenham was uninjured by either heat ray or the black smoke, and there were more people about here, though none could really give us any news. For the most part they were like ourselves, taking advantage of a lull to shift their quarters. I have an impression that many of the houses here were still occupied by scared inhabitants, too frightened even for flight. Here, too, the evidence of a hasty rout was abundant along the road. I remember most vividly 3 smashed bicycles in a heap, pounded into the road by the wheels of subsequent carts. We crossed Richmond Bridge about 8:30. We hurried across the exposed bridge, of course, but I noticed something floating down the stream. A number of red masses, some many feet across. I didn't know what those were. There wasn't any time for scrutiny, and I put a more horrible interpretation on them than they deserved. Here again on the Surrey side was the black dust that had once been smoke and dead bodies, a heap near the approach to the station, but we had no glimpse of the Martians until we were some way toward Barnes. We saw in the blackened distance a group of 3 people running down a side street towards the river, but otherwise it seemed deserted. Up the hill, Richmond town was burning briskly, and outside the town of Richmond there was no trace of the black smoke. Then, suddenly, as we approached Kew, came a number of people running, and the upper works of the Martian fighting machine loomed in sight over us from the housetops, not 100 yards away from us. We stood aghast at our danger, and had the Martian looked down, we must have immediately perished. We were so terrified that we dared not go on, but turned aside and hid the shed in a garden. Then the curate crouched, weeping silently, and refused to stir again. My fixed idea, however, of reaching Leatherhead would not let me rest, and in the twilight I ventured out again. I went through a shrubbery and along a passage beside a big house standing in its own grounds, and so emerged upon the road towards Kew. The curate I left in the shed, but he soon came hurrying after me. That second start was the most foolhardy thing I ever did, for it was manifest the Martians were about us. No sooner had the curate overtaken me than we saw either the fighting machine we'd seen before, or another, far away across the meadows in the direction of Kew Lodge. 4 or 5 little black figures hurried before it came across the little green-gray of the field, and in a moment it was evident that this Martian pursued them. In 3 strides he was among them, and they ran radiating from his feet in all directions. He used no heat ray to destroy them, but instead picked them up one by one. Apparently, he tossed them into a great metallic carrier which projected behind him, as much as a workman's basket hangs over his shoulder. It was the first time I realized that the Martians might have any other purpose than destruction with their defeated humanity. We stood for a moment, petrified, then turned and fled through a gate behind us, into a walled garden, fell into, rather than found, a fortunate ditch, and lay there, scarce daring to whisper to each other until the stars were out. I suppose it was nearly 11 o'clock before we gathered courage to start again, no longer venturing into the road, but sneaking along hedgerows and through plantations, and watching keenly through the darkness, he on the right and I on the left, for the Martians, who seemed to be all about us. In one place we blundered upon a scorched and blackened area, now cooling and ashen, and a number of scattered dead bodies of men, burned horribly about the heads and trunks, but with their legs and boots mostly intact, and of dead horses, 50 feet perhaps, behind a line of 4 ripped guns and smashed gun carriages. Sheen, it seemed, had escaped destruction, but the place was silent and deserted. Here we happened upon no dead, thankfully, though the night was too dark for us to see into the side roads of that place. In Sheen, my companion suddenly complained of faintness and thirst, and so we decided to try one of the houses. The first house we entered, after a little difficulty with the window, was a small, semi-detached villa. Yeah, I always want to say villa, but it's villa. Watch me have that backwards. After a little difficulty with the window was a small, semi-detached villa, and I found nothing eatable left in the place but some moldy cheese. There was, however, water to drink, and I took a hatchet, which promised to be useful in our next housebreaking. We then crossed to a place where the road turns towards Mortlake. Here there stood a white house within a walled garden, and in the pantry of this domicile we found a store of food, 2 loaves of bread in a pan, an uncooked steak, and the half of a ham. I give this catalogue so precisely because, as it happened, we were destined to subsist upon this store for the next fortnight. Bottled beer stood under a shelf, and there were 2 bags of haricot beans and some limp lettuces. The pantry opened into a kind of wash-up kitchen, and in this there was firewood. There was also a cupboard, in which we found nearly a dozen of burgundy tinned soups, and salmon, and 2 tins of biscuits. We sat in the adjacent kitchen in the dark, for we dared not strike a light, and ate bread and ham, and drank beer out of the same bottle. The curate, who was still timorous and restless, was now, oddly enough, for pushing on, and I was urging him to keep up his strength by eating when the thing happened that was to imprison us. It can't be midnight yet, I said, and then came a blinding glare of vivid green light. Everything in the kitchen leaped out, clearly visible in the green and black, and vanished again. And then followed such a concussion that I have never heard before, or since, for that matter. So close on the heels of this, as to seem instantaneous, came a thud behind me, a clash of glass, a crash, and rattle of falling masonry all about us, and the plaster of the ceiling came down upon us, smashing into a multitude of fragments upon our heads. I was knocked headlong across the floor, against the oven handle, and stunned. I was insensible for quite a while, the curate told me, and when I came to, we were in the darkness, and he, with a face wet, as I found afterwards, with blood from a cut forehead, was daubing water over me. For some time I couldn't recollect what had happened. Then things came to me, albeit slowly. A bruise on my temple asserted itself. Are you better?" asked the curate in a whisper. At last I answered him and sat up. "Don't move," he said. "The floor is covered with smashed crockery from the dresser. You can't possibly move without making a noise, and I fancy they are outside." We both sat silently so that we could scarcely hear each other breathing. Everything seemed deadly still, but once something near us, some plaster or broken brickwork, slid down with a rumbling sound. Outside and very near was an intermittent, metallic rattle. "That," said the curate when presently it happened again. "Yes, but what is it?" "A Martian," said the curate. I listened again. It wasn't like the heat ray," I said, and for a time I was inclined to think that one of the great fighting machines had stumbled against the house, as I had seen one stumble against the tower of the Shepperton Church. Our situation was so strange and incomprehensible that for 3 or 4 hours, until the dawn came, we scarcely moved. And then the light filtered in, not through a window, which remained black, but through a triangular aperture, between a beam and a heap of broken bricks in the wall behind us. The interior of the kitchen we now saw grayly for the first time. The window had been burst in by a mass of garden mold, which flowed over the table upon which we had been sitting, and lay about our feet. Outside, the soil was banked high against the house. At the top of the window frame, we could see an uprooted drain pipe. The floor was littered with smashed hardware. The end of the kitchen towards the house was broken into, and since the daylight shone in there, it was evident that the greater part of this house had collapsed. Contrasting vividly with this ruin was the neat dresser, stained in the fashion, pale green, and with a number of copper and tin vessels below it, the wallpaper imitating blue and white tiles, and a number of colored supplements fluttering from the walls above the kitchen range. As the dawn grew clearer, we saw through the gap in the wall the body of a Martian, standing sentinel, I suppose, over the still glowing cylinder. At the sight of that, we crawled as circumspectly as possible out of the twilight of the kitchen into the darkness of the scullery. Abruptly, the right interpretation dawned upon my mind. The fifth cylinder! Rather, he's whispering. The fifth cylinder! The fifth shot from Mars! It struck this house and buried us under the ruins! For a time, the curate was silent, and then he whispered, God have mercy upon us. I heard him presently whimpering to himself. Save for that sound, we lay quite still in the scullery. For my part, I scarce dared breathe, and sat with my eyes fixed upon the faint light of the kitchen door. I could just see the curate's face, a dim oval shape, and his collar and cuffs. Outside there began a metallic hammering, then a violent hooting. Ooh! And then, after a quiet interval, a hissing like the hissing of an engine. These noises, for the most part problematical, continued intermittently, and seemed, if anything, to increase in number as time wore on. Presently a measured thudding and a vibration that made everything about us quiver, and the vessels in the pantry ring and shift, began and continued. Once the light was eclipsed, the ghostly kitchen doorway became absolutely dark. For many hours, we must have crouched there, silent and shivering, until our tired attention had failed. However, at last I found myself awake and very hungry. I was inclined to believe that we must have spent the greater portion of a day before that awakening. My hunger was at a stride so insistent that it moved me to action. I told the curate I was going to seek food and felt my way toward the pantry. He made no answer, but so soon as I began eating, the faint noise I had made stirred him up, and I heard him crawling after me. Chapter 2. What we saw from the ruined house. After eating, we crept back to the scullery, and there I must have dozed again, for when I presently looked round, I was alone. The thudding vibration continued with wearisome persistence. I whispered for the curate several times, and at last felt my way to the door of the kitchen. It was still daylight, and I perceived him across the room, lying against the triangular hole that looked out upon the Martians. His shoulders were hunched so that his head was hidden from me. I could hear a number of noises almost like those in an engine shed, and the place rocked with that beating thud. Through the aperture in the wall, I could see the top of a tree touched with gold in the warm blue of a tranquil evening sky. For a moment or so, I remained watching the curate, and then I advanced, crouching and stepping with extreme care amid the broken crockery that littered the floor. I touched the curate's leg, and he started so violently that a mass of plaster went sliding down outside and fell with a loud impact. I gripped his arm, fearing he might cry out, and for a long time we crouched, motionless. Then I turned to see how much of the rampart remained. The detachment of the plaster had left a vertical split open in the debris, and by raising myself cautiously across a beam, I was able to see out of this gap into what had been overnight a quiet suburban roadway. Vast indeed was the change that we beheld. The fifth cylinder must have fallen right into the midst of the house we had first visited. The building had vanished, completely smashed, pulverized, as though it was dispersed by the blow. The cylinder lay now far beneath the original foundations, deep in a hole, already vastly larger than the pit I had looked to in Woking at the beginning of our journey. The earth all around it had splashed under at the tremendous impact. Splash is the only word that would apply, and it lay in heaped piles that hid the masses of the adjacent houses. It had behaved exactly like mud under the violent blow of a hammer. Our house had collapsed backward. The front portion, even on the ground floor, had been destroyed completely. By a chance, the kitchen and scullery had escaped and stood buried now under soil and ruins, closed in by tons of earth on every side save towards the cylinder. Over that aspect we hung now on the very edge of a great circular pit the Martians were very engaged in making. The heavy beating sound was evidently just behind us, and ever and again a green vapor drove up like a veil across our peephole. The cylinder was already opened in the center of the pit, and on the farther edge of the pit, amid the smashed and gravel-heaped shrubbery, one of the great fighting machines, deserted by its occupant, stood stiff and tall against the evening sky. At first I scarcely noted the pit and the cylinder, although it has been convenient to describe them first, on account of the extraordinary glittering mechanism I saw busy in the excavation, and on account of the strange creatures that were crawling slowly and painfully across the heaped mold towards it. The mechanism it certainly was that held my attention first. It was one of those complicated fabrics that has been since called handling machines, and the study of which has already been given such an enormous impetus to terrestrial invention. As it dawned on me first, it presented a sort of metallic spider with 5 jointed agile legs, and with an extraordinary number of jointed levers, bars, and reaching and clutching tentacles about its body. Most of its arms were retracted, but with 3 long tentacles it was fishing out a number of rods, plates, and bars which lined the covering and apparently strengthened the walls of the cylinder. These, as it extracted them, were lifted out and deposited upon a level surface of earth behind it. Its motion was so swift, complex, and perfect that at first I didn't see it as a machine, in spite of its metallic glitter. The fighting machines were coordinated and animated to an extraordinary pitch, but nothing to compare with this. People who have never seen those structures and have only the ill-imagined efforts of artists or the imperfect descriptions of such eyewitnesses as myself to go upon scarcely realize that living quality. I recall particularly the illustration of one of the first pamphlets to give a consecutive account of the war. The artist had evidently made a hasty study of one of the fighting machines, and there had his knowledge ended. He presented them as tilted, stiff tripods without either flexibility or subtlety, and with an altogether misleading monotony of effect. The pamphlet containing these renderings had a considerable vogue, and I mention them here simply to warn the reader against the impression that they may have created. They were no more like the Martians I saw in action than a Dutch doll is like a human being. To my mind, the pamphlet would have been much better without the artist's renditions. At first, I say, the handling machine did not impress me as a machine, but as a crab-like creature with a glittering integument. The controlling Martian whose delicate tentacles actuated its movements seeming to be simply the equivalent of the crab's cerebral portion. But then I perceived the resemblance of its gray-brown, shiny leather integument to that of the other sprawling bodies beyond, and the true nature of the dexterous workman dawned upon me. With that realization, my interest shifted to these other creatures, the real Martians. Already I had a transient impression of these, and the first nausea no longer obscured my observation. Moreover, I was concealed and motionless, and under no urgency of action for that matter. They were, I now saw, the most unearthly creatures it is possible to conceive. There were huge round bodies, or rather heads, about 4 feet in diameter, each body having in front of it a face. This face had no nostrils. Indeed, the Martians do not seem to have had any sense of smell, but it had a pair of very large, dark-colored eyes, and just beneath this a kind of fleshy beak. In the back of this head or body, I scarcely know how to speak of it, was the single tight tympanic, rather. Ooh, that's quite the word. Was the single tight tympanic surface, since known to be anatomically an ear, though it must have been almost useless in our dense air. Just a moment, I seem to have lost my page. Well, that's unfortunate. Well, that's rather annoying. I mispressed a button and it went to the next chapter. Oops. Tympanic. Let's see what that word means. Tympanic, anatomy, of, relating to, or having a tympanum, resembling or acting like a drum head. That's why it's an ear. Duly noted. In a group round the mouth were 16 slender, almost whip-like tentacles, arranged in 2 bunches of 8 each. These bunches have been since named rather aptly by the distinguished anatomist Professor Howe's the hands. Even as I saw these Martians for the first time, they seemed to be endeavoring to raise themselves on these hands, but of course, with the increased weight of the terrestrial conditions, this was impossible. There is reason to suppose that on Mars they may have progressed upon them with some facility, actually. The internal anatomy, as I may remark here, as dissection is since shown, was almost equally simple. The greater part of the structure was the brain, sending enormous nerves to the eyes, ear, and tactile tentacles. Besides this were the bulky lungs, into which the mouth opened, and by the heart and its vessels. The pulmonary stress caused by the denser atmosphere and greater gravitational attraction was only too evident in the convulsive movements of the outer skin. And this was the sum of the Martian organs. Strange as it may seem to a human being, all of the complex apparatus of digestion which makes up the bulk of our bodies did not exist in the Martians. They were heads, merely heads. Entrails they had none. They did not eat, much less digest. Instead, they took the fresh, living blood of other creatures and injected it into their own veins. I myself have seen this being done, as I shall mention in its place, but squeamish as I may seem, I cannot bring myself to describe what I could not endure to even continue watching. Let it suffice to say, blood obtained from a still living animal, in most cases from a human being, was run directly by means of a little pipette into the recipient canal. The bare idea of this is no doubt horribly repulsive to us, but at the same time I think that we should remember how repulsive our carnivorous habits would seem to an intelligent rabbit. The physiological advantages of the practice of injection are undeniable if one thinks of the tremendous waste of human time and energy occasioned by eating in the digestive process. Our bodies are half made up of glands and tubes and organs, occupied into turning heterogeneous food into blood. The digestive processes and their reaction upon the nervous system sap our strength and color our minds. Men go happy or miserable as they have healthy or unhealthy livers or sound gastric glands. But the Martians were lifted above all these organic fluctuations of mood and emotion. Their undeniable preference for men as their source of nourishment is partially explained by the nature of the remains of the victims they had brought with them as provisions from Mars. These creatures, to judge from the shriveled remains that have fallen into human hands, were bipeds with flimsy, siliceous skeletons, almost like those of the siliceous sponges, and feeble musculature, standing about 6 feet high and having round erect heads and large eyes in flinty sockets. 2 or 3 of them seemed to have been brought in each cylinder, and all were killed before the Earth was reached. It was just as well for them, for the mere attempt to stand upright upon our planet would have broken every bone in their bodies. And while I am engaged in this description, I may add in this place certain further details which, although they were not relevant to us at the time, will enable the reader who is unacquainted with them to form a clearer picture of these offensive creatures. In 3 other points, their physiology differed strangely from ours. These organisms did not sleep any more than the heart of a man would sleep. Since they had no extensive muscular mechanism to recuperate, that periodical extinction was unknown to them. They had little or no sense of fatigue, it would seem. On Earth they could never have moved without effort, but yet even to the last they kept in action. In the 24 hours, they did 24 hours of work, as even on Earth is perhaps the case with ants. In the next place, wonderful as it seems, in a sexual world, the Martians were absolutely without sex, and therefore without any of the tumultuous emotions that arise from that difference among men. A young Martian, there now can be no dispute, was really born upon Earth during the war, and it was found attached to its parent, partially budded off, just as young lily bulbs bud off, or like the young animals in the freshwater polyp. In man, in all the higher terrestrial animals, such a method of increase has disappeared, but even on the Earth, it was certainly a primitive method. Among the lower animals, even up to those the first cousins of the vertebrated animals, the tushinates, the two processes occur side by side. But finally, our chosen method had superseded its competitor altogether. On Mars, however, just the reverse was the case. It is worthy of remark that a certain speculative writer of quasi-scientific repute, writing long before the Martian invasion, did forecast for man a final structure not unlike the actual Martian condition. His prophecy, I remember, appeared in November or December 1893 in a long-defunct publication, the Pall Mall Budget, and I recall a caricature of it in a pre-Martian periodical called Punch. He pointed out, writing in a foolish, facetious tone, that the perfection of mechanical appliances must ultimately supersede limbs, the perfection of chemical devices digestion, that such organs as hair, external nose, teeth, ears, and chin were no longer essential parts of the human being, and that the tendency of natural selection would lie in the coming of their steady diminution through the coming ages. The brain alone remained a cardinal necessity. Only one other part of the body had a strong case for survival, and that was the hand, teacher and agent of the brain. While the rest of the body dwindled, the hands would simply grow larger. There is many a true word written in jest, and here are the Martians. We have beyond dispute the actual accomplishment of such a suppression of the animal side of the organism by the intelligence. To me, it is quite credible that the Martians may be descended from beings not unlike ourselves, by a gradual development of the brain and hands, the latter giving rise to the two bunches of delicate tentacles at last, at the expense of the rest of their body. Without the body, the brain would, of course, become a mere selfish intelligence, without any of the emotional substratum of the human being. The last salient point in which the systems of these creatures differed from ours was in what one might have thought of a very trivial particular. Microorganisms which cause so much disease and pain on Earth have either neither appeared upon Mars or Martian sanitary science eliminated them ages ago. 100 diseases, all the fevers and contagions of human life, consumption, cancers, tumors, and other such morbidities, they never enter their scheme of life. And speaking of the differences between the life on Mars and terrestrial life, I may allude here to the curious suggestions of the red weed. Apparently, the vegetable kingdom in Mars, instead of having green for a dominant color, is of a vivid blood-red tint. At any rate, the seed which the Martians, intentionally or accidentally, brought with them, gave rise, in all cases, to red-colored growths. Only known popularly as the red weed, however, it gained any footing in competition with terrestrial forms. The red creeper was quite a transitory growth, and few people have actually ever seen it growing. For a time, however, the red weed grew with astonishing vigor and luxuriance. It spread up at the sides of the pit by the third or fourth day of our imprisonment, and its cactus-like branches formed a carmine fringe to the edges of our triangular window. And afterwards I found it broadcast throughout the country, especially wherever there was a stream of water. The Martians had what appears to be a single auditory organ, a single round drum, at the back of the head body, and with eyes that had a visual range not very different from ours, except according to Phillips, blue and violet were as black to them. It is commonly supposed they communicated by sounds and tentacular gesticulations. This is asserted, for instance, in the able but hastily compiled pamphlet, written evidently by someone not an eyewitness of Martian actions, to which I've already alluded, and which, so far, has been the chief source of information concerning them. Now, no surviving human being saw so much of the Martians' inactions as I did. I take no credit to myself for an accident, but the fact is so. And I assert that I have watched them closely, time after time, that I've seen 4 or 5, and once 6 of them sluggishly performing the most elaborately complicated operations together, without either sound or gesture. Their peculiar hooting invariably preceded feeding, however. It had no modulation, and was, I believe, in no sense a signal, but merely the expiration of air preparatory to the suctional operation. I have a certain claim to at least an elementary knowledge of psychology, and in this matter I am convinced, as firmly as I am convinced of anything, that the Martians interchange thoughts without any physical intermediation. And I have been convinced of this in spite of strong preconceptions. Before the Martian invasion, as an occasional reader here or there may remember, I had written with some little vehemence against the telepathic theory. The Martians wore no clothing. Their conceptions of ornament and decorum were necessarily different from ours, and not only were they evidently much less sensible of changes in temperatures than we are, but changes of pressure do not seem to affect their health at all seriously either. And yet they wore no clothing. Yet though they wore no clothing, it was in the other artificial additions to their body resources that their great superiority over man lay. We men, with our bicycles and road skates, our Lilienthal soaring machines, our guns and sticks and so forth, are just in the beginning of the evolution that the Martians have worked out. They've become practically mere brains, wearing different bodies according to their needs, just as men wear suits of clothes and take a bicycle in a hurry, or an umbrella in the wet. And of their appearances, perhaps nothing is more wonderful to a man than the curious fact that what is the dominant feature of almost all human devices in the mechanism is absence. The wheel is absent among all the other things that they brought to Earth. There's no trace or suggestion of their use of wheels. One would have expected it at least in a locomotion. Yet in this connection it is curious to remark that even on this earth nature has never hit upon the wheel, or has preferred other expedients to its development. And not only did the Martians either not know of, which is incredible, or abstain from the wheel, but in their apparatus singularly little use is made of the fixed pivot or relatively fixed pivot, with circular motions thereabout confined to one plane. Almost all the joints of the machinery present a complicated system of sliding parts moving over small but beautifully curved friction bearings. And while upon this level of detail, it is remarkable that the long leverages of their machines are in most cases actuated by a sort of sham musculature of the discs in elastic sheath. These discs become polarized and drawn closely and powerfully together when transversed by a current of electricity. In this way, the curious parallelism to the animal motions, which was so striking and disturbing to the human beholder, was attained. Such quasi-muscle abounded in the crab-like handling machine, which, on my first peeping out of the slit, I watched unpacking the cylinder. It seemed infinitely more alive than the actual Martians lying beyond it in the sunset, panting, stirring ineffectual tentacles, and moving feebly after their vast journey across space. While I was watching their sluggish motions in the sunlight and noting each strange detail of their form, the curate reminded me of his presence by pulling violently at my arm. I turned to his scowling face and silent, eloquent lips. He wanted to look through the slit, which permitted only one of us to peep through, and so I had to forego watching them for a time while he enjoyed that privilege. When I looked again, the busy handling machine had already put together several of the pieces of the apparatus it had taken out of the cylinder into a shape having an unmistakable likeness to its own, and down on the left a little busy digging mechanism had come into view, emitting jets of green vapor and working its way around the pit, excavating and embanking it in a methodical and discriminating manner. This was what had caused the regular beating noise and the rhythmic shocks that had kept our ruinous refuge quivering. It piped and whistled as it worked. So far as I could see, the thing was without a directing Martian at all. Just give me a moment. I need some water before we start the next chapter. All right. Chapter 3, The Days of Imprisonment. The arrival of a second fighting machine drove us from our peephole into the scullery, for we feared that upon his elevation the Martian might see down upon us behind our barrier. At a later date we began to feel less in danger of their eyes, for to an eye in the dazzle of the sunlight outside, our refuge must have been blank blackness. But at first, the slightest suggestion of approach drove us into the scullery in heart-throbbing retreat. Yet terrible as was the danger we incurred, the attraction of peeping was for both of us irresistible. And I recall now with a sort of wonder, in spite of the infinite danger in which we were between starvation and a still more terrible death, we could yet struggle bitterly for that horrible privilege of sight. We would race across the kitchen in a grotesque way between eagerness and the dread of making a noise, and strike each other and thrust and kick within a few inches of exposure. The fact is that we had absolutely incompatible dispositions and habits of thought and action, and our danger and isolation only accentuated the incompatibility. At Halliford, I had already come to hate the curate's trick of mindless, helpless exclamation, his stupid rigidity of mind. His endless muttering monologue vitiated every effort I had made to think out a line of action, and drove me at times, thus pent up and intensified, almost to the verge of craziness. He was as lacking in restraint as a silly person. He would weep for hours together, and I verily believe that to the very end this spoiled child of life thought his weak tears in some way efficacious. And I would sit in the darkness, unable to keep my mind off of him by reason of his importunities. He ate more than I did, and it was in vain that I pointed out that our only chance of life was to stop in the house until the Martians had done with their pit, that in a long patience a time might presently come when we should need food. However, he ate and drank impulsively in heavy meals at long intervals, and he slept little. As the days wore on, his utter carelessness of consideration so intensified our distress and danger that I had, as much as I loathed doing it, to resort to threats, and at last to blows. That brought him to reason for a time, but he was one of those weak creatures void of pride, timorous, anemic, with a hateful soul, full of shifty cunning, who faced neither God nor man, and hardly even faced themselves. It is disagreeable for me to recall and write these things, but I set them down that my story may lack nothing. Those who have escaped the dark and terrible aspects of life will find my brutality, my flesh of rage, and our final tragedy easy enough to blame, for they know what is wrong as well as any, but not what is possible to tortured men. But those who have been under the shadow, those who have gone down at last to elemental things, will have a wider charity. And while within, we fought our dark, dim contest of whispers, snatched food and drink, and gripping hands and blows. Without, in the pitiless sunlight of that terrible June, was the strange wonder, the unfamiliar routine of the Martians in the pit. Let me return to those first new experiences of mine. After a long time, I ventured back to the peephole to find that the newcomers had been reinforced by the occupants of no fewer than 3 of the fighting machines. These last had brought with them certain fresh appliances that stood in an orderly manner about the cylinder. The second handling machine was now completed and was busy in serving one of the novel contrivances that the big machine had brought. This was a body resembling a milk can in its general form, above which oscillated a pear-shaped receptacle, and from which a stream of white powder flowed into a circular basin below. The oscillatory motion was imparted to this by one tentacle of the handling machine. With 2 spatulate hands of the handing machine was digging out and flinging masses of clay into the pear-shaped receptacle above, while with another arm it periodically opened a door and removed rusty and blackened clinkers from the middle part of the machine. Another steely tentacle directed the powder from the basin along a ribbed channel towards some sort of receiver that was hidden by the mound of bluish dust. From this unseen receiver, a little thread of green smoke rose vertically into the quiet air. As I looked, the handling machine, with a faint and musical clinking, extended, telescopic fashion, a tentacle that had been a moment before a mere blunt projection, until its end was hidden beyond the mound of clay. In another second it had lifted a bar of white aluminum into sight, untarnished as yet, and dazzling brightly, and deposited into a growing stack of bars that stood at the side of the pit. Between sunset and starlight, this dexterous machine must have made more than 100 such bars out of the crude clay, and the mound of bluish dust rose steadily until it topped the side of the pit. The contrast between the swift and complex movements of these contrivances and the inert, panting clumsiness of their masters was acute, and for days I had to tell myself repeatedly these latter were indeed the living of the two things. The curate had possession of the slit when the first men were brought to the pit. I was sitting below, huddled up, listening with all my ears. He made a sudden movement backwards, and I, fearful that we were observed, crouched down in a spasm of terror. He came sliding down the rubbish and crept beside me in the darkness, inarticulate, gesticulating, and for a moment I shared his panic. His gestures suggested a resignation of the slit, and after a little while my curiosity gave me courage, and I rose up, stepped across him, and clambered to it. At first I could see no reason for his frantic behavior. The twilight had now come. The stars were little and faint, but the pit was illuminated by the flickering green fire that came from the aluminum making. The whole picture was a flickering scheme of green gleams and shifting rusty black shadows, strangely trying to the eyes. Over and through it all went the bats, heeding it not at all. The sprawling Martians were no longer to be seen. The mound of blue-green powder had risen to cover them from sight, and a fighting machine, with its legs contracted, crumpled and abbreviated, stood across the corner of the pit. Then, amid the clangor of the machinery, came the drifting suspicion of human voices that I entertained only at first to dismiss. I crouched, watching this fighting machine closely, satisfying myself now, for the first time, that the hood did indeed contain a Martian. As the green flames lifted, I could see the oil gleam of his integument and the brightness of his eyes. And suddenly I heard a yell, and a long tentacle reached over the shoulder of the machine to the little cage that stretched upon its back. Then something struggling violently, was lifted high against the sky, a black, vague enigma against the starlight. And as this black object came down again, I saw by the green brightness that it was a man. For an instant he was clearly visible. He was a stout, ruddy, middle-aged man, well-dressed 3 days before. He must have been walking the world, a man of considerable consequence for that matter. I could see his staring eyes and gleams of light on his studs and watch chain. He vanished behind the mound, and for a moment there was silence, and then a shrieking and a sustained and cheerful hooting from the Martians. I slid down the rubbish, struggled to my feet, clapped my hands over my ears, and bolted into the scullery. The curate, who had been crouching silently with his arms over his head, looked up as I passed, cried out quite loudly at my desertion of him, and came running after me. That night, as we lurked in the scullery, balanced between our horror and the terrible fascination of this peeping head, although I felt an urgent need of action, I tried in vain to conceive some plan of escape, but afterwards, during the second day, I was able to consider our position with great clearness. The curate, I found, was quite incapable of discussion, however. This new and culminating atrocity had robbed him of all vestiges of reason or forethought. Practically, he had sunk to the level of an animal. But as the saying goes, I gripped myself with both hands. It grew upon my mind, once I could face the facts, that terrible as our position was, there was, as yet, no justification for our absolute despair. Our chief chance lay in the possibility of the Martians making the pit nothing more than a temporary encampment. Or even if they kept it permanently, they might not consider it necessary to guard it, and that could be our chance at escape. I also weighed very carefully the possibility of digging a way out in a direction away from the pit, but the chances of our emerging within sight of some sentinel fighting machine seemed, at first, too great. and I would have to do all the digging myself. The curate certainly would have failed me. It was on the third day, if my memory serves me right, that I saw the lad killed. It was the only occasion on which I actually saw the Martians feed. After that experience, I avoided the hole in the wall for the better part of a day. I went into the scullery, removed the door, and spent some hours digging around with my hatchet as quiet as I could manage. But when I had made a hole about a couple feet deep, the loose earth collapsed noisily and I didn't dare continue. I lost heart and lay down on the scullery floor for a long time, having no spirit even to move. And after that, I abandoned altogether the idea of escaping by excavation. It says much for the impression of the Martians that made upon me that at first I entertained little or no hope of our escape being brought about by their overthrow, through any human effort anyway. But on the fourth or fifth night, I heard a sound like heavy guns. It was very late in the night, and the moon was shining brightly. The Martians had taken away the excavating machine, and save for a fighting machine that stood in the remoter bank of the pit, and a handling machine that was buried out of my sight in the corner of the pit, immediately beneath my peephole, the place was deserted by them, except for the pale glow from the handling machine, and the bars and patches of white moonlight. The pit was in darkness, and except for the clinking of the handling machine, quite still. That night was a beautiful serenity. Save for one planet, the moon seemed to have the sky to herself. I heard a dog howling, and that familiar sound was what made me listen. Then I heard quite distinctly a booming, exactly like the sound of great guns. 6 distinct reports, I counted, and after a long interval, 6 again. And that was all. And so another hour has elapsed in our adventure with War of the Worlds. I would firmly suggest getting up, maybe taking a few stretches, if you've been sitting listening to this. It's not good to sit still for more than an hour, as far as I know anyway. And so we move on to Chapter 4. And with this, we only have, as I recall, 6 chapters left in the book. But anyway, Chapter 4, The Death of the Curate. It was on the 6th day of our imprisonment that I peeped for the last time, and presently found myself alone. Instead of keeping close to me and trying to oust me from the slit, the curate had gone back into the scullery. I was struck by a sudden thought, and I went back quickly and quietly into the scullery. In the darkness, I heard the curate drinking. I snatched in the darkness, and my fingers caught a bottle of Burgundy. For a few moments there was a tussle. The bottle struck the floor and broke, and I desisted and rose. We stood, panting and threatening each other. In the end, I planted myself between him and the food, and told him of my determination to begin a discipline. I divided the food in his pantry into rations to last us 10 days. I would not let him eat any more that day. In the afternoon, he made a feeble effort to get at the food. I'd been dozing, but in an instant I was awake. All day and night we sat face to face. I was weary but resolute, and he was weeping and complaining of his immediate hunger. It was, I know, a night and a day, but to me it seemed, and it still seems now, an indeterminable length of time. And so our widened incompatibility ended at last in open conflict. For 2 vast days we struggled in undertones and wrestling contests. There were times when I beat and kicked him madly, times when I cajoled and persuaded him, and once I tried to bribe him with the last bottle of Burgundy, for there was a rainwater pump from which I could get water. But neither force nor kindness availed. He was indeed beyond reason. He would neither desist from his attacks on the food, nor from his noisy babbling to himself. The rudimentary precautions to keep our imprisonment endurable he would not observe. Slowly I began to realize the complete overthrow of his intelligence, to perceive that my sole companion in this close and sickly darkness was a man insane. From certain vague memories, I'm inclined to think my own mind did its own wandering at times. I had strange and hideous dreams whenever I slept. It sounds paradoxical, but I'm inclined to think that the weakness and sanity of the curate warned me, braced me, and kept me a sane man. On the 8th day, he began to talk aloud instead of whispering, and nothing I could do would moderate his speech. "It's just, oh God," he would say over and over again. "It's just, on me and mine be the punishment laid. We've sinned, we've fallen short. There was poverty, sorrow. The poor were trodden in the dust, and I held my peace. I preached acceptable folly. My God, what folly! When I should have stood up, though I died for it, and called upon them to repent. Repent, oppressors of the poor and needy, the winepress of God." Then he would suddenly revert to the matter of the food I withheld from him, praying, begging, weeping, at last threatening. He began to raise his voice. I prayed him not to. He perceived a hold on me. He threatened he would shout and bring the Martians upon us. For a time that scared me, but any concession would have shortened our chance of escape beyond estimating. I defied him, though I felt no assurance that he might not do this thing. But at that day, at any rate, he did not. He talked with his voice rising slowly through the greater part of the 8th and 9th days, threats, entreaties, mingled with a torrent of half-sane and always frothy repentance for his vacant sham of God's service, such as made me pity him. Then he slept a while, and began again with renewed strength, so loudly that I must need to make him desist. "Be still," I implored. He rose to his knees, for he had been sitting in the darkness near the copper. "I've been still too long," he said, in a tone that must have reached into the pit, "and now I must bear my witness. Woe unto this unfaithful city! Woe! Woe to the inhabitants of the earth by the reason of other voices of the trumpet!" "Shut up," I said, rising to my feet, in a terror lest the Martian should hear us. "For God's sake!" "Nay," shouted the curate at the top of his voice, standing likewise and extending his arms. "Speak! The word of the Lord is upon me." In 3 strides he was at the door leading into the kitchen. "I must bear my witness. I go. It has already been too long delayed." I put out my hand and felt the meat chopper hanging to the wall. In a flash I was after him. I was fierce with fear. Before he was halfway across the kitchen I had overtaken him. With one last touch of humanity, I turned the blade back and struck him with the butt. He went headlong forward and lay stretched on the ground. I stumbled over him and stood panting. He lay still. Suddenly I heard a noise without, the run and smash of slippering plaster, and the triangular aperture in the wall was darkened. I looked up and saw the lower surface of a handling machine coming slowly across the hole. One of its gripping limbs curled amid the debris. Another limb appeared, feeling its way over the fallen beams. I stood petrified, staring. Then I saw through a sort of a glass plate near the edge of the body the face. The face, as we may call it, and the large dark eyes of the Martian, peering. Then a long metallic snake of a tentacle came feeling slowly through the hole. I turned by an effort, stumbled over the curate, and stopped at the scullery door. The tentacle was now some way 2 yards or more in the room, and twisting and turning, with strange, sudden movements this way and that. For a while I was fascinated by that slow, fitful advance. Then, with a faint, hoarse cry, I forced myself across the scullery. I trembled violently. I could scarcely stand upright. I opened the door of the coal cellar and stood there in the darkness, staring at the faintly lit doorway into the kitchen and listening. Had the Martian seen me? What was it doing now? Something was moving to and fro there, very quietly, and every now and then it tapped against the wall, or started on its movements with a faint metallic ringing, like the movements of keys on a split ring. Then a heavy body, I knew too well what, was dragged across the floor of the kitchen towards the opening. Irresistibly attracted, I crept to the door and peeped into the kitchen. In the triangle of the bright outer sunlight, I saw the Martian, in its Briareus of a handling machine, scrutinizing the curate's head. I thought at once it would infer my presence from the mark of the blow I'd given him. I crept back to the coal cellar, shut the door, and began to cover myself as much as I could, and as noiselessly as possible in the darkness, among the firewood and coal therein. Every now and then I paused, rigid, to hear if the Martian had thrust its tentacles through the opening again. Then the faint metallic jingle returned. I traced it slowly, feeling over the kitchen. Presently I heard it nearer, in the scullery as I had judged. I thought that its length might be insufficient to reach me. I prayed copiously. As it passed, scraping faintly against the cellar door, an age of almost intolerable silence and suspense intervened. Then I heard it fumbling at the latch. It had found the door. The Martians understood doors. It worried to the catch for a minute, perhaps, and then the door opened. In the darkness, I could just see the thing, like an elephant's trunk more than anything else, waving towards me and touching and examining the wall, coals, wood, and ceiling. It was like a black worm swaying its blind head to and fro. Once even it touched the heel of my boot. I was on the verge of screaming. I bit my hand. For a time, the tentacle was silent. I could have fancied it had been withdrawn. Presently, with an abrupt click, it gripped something. I thought it had me, and seemed to go out of the cellar again. For a moment I wasn't sure, but apparently it had taken a lump of coal to examine. I seized the opportunity of slightly shifting my position, which had become cramped, and then listened. I whispered passionate prayers for safety. Then I heard the slow, deliberate sound creeping towards me again. Slowly, ever so slowly, it drew near, scratching against the walls and tapping the furniture. While I was still doubtful, it rapped smartly against the cellar door and closed it. I heard it go into the pantry, and the biscuit tins rattled and a bottle smashed, and then came a heavy bump against the cellar door. Then silence that passed into an infinity of suspense. Had it gone? At last I decided that it had. It came into the scullery no more, but I lay all the 10th day in close darkness, buried among coals and firewood, not even daring to crawl out for the drink which I craved. It was the 11th day before I ventured so far from my security. Chapter 5, The Stillness. My first act before I went into the pantry was to fasten the door between the kitchen and the scullery. But the pantry was empty. Every scrap of food had gone. Apparently the Martian had taken it all on the previous day. At that discovery I despaired for the first time. I took no food, no drink either, on the 11th or the 12th day. At first my mouth and throat were parched, and my strength ebbed sensibly. I sat about in the darkness of the scullery in a state of despondent wretchedness. My mind ran on eating. I thought I'd become deaf for the noises of movement I'd become accustomed to hearing from the pit. They'd ceased absolutely. I didn't feel strong enough to crawl noiselessly to the peephole, or I would have gone there. On the 12th day, my throat was so painful that, taking the chance of alarming the Martians, I attacked the creaking rainwater pump that stood by the sink. Oh dear, that was a loud noise. I attacked the creaking rainwater pump that stood by the sink and got a couple of glassfuls of blackened and tainted rainwater. I was greatly refreshed by this, and emboldened by the fact that no inquiring tentacle followed the noise of my pumping. During these days, in a rambling, inconclusive way, I thought much of the curate and the manner of his death. On the 13th day I drank some more water, and dozed and thought disjointedly of eating and of vague, impossible plans of escape. Whenever I dozed, I dreamt of horrible phantasm, or of the death of the curate, or of sumptuous dinners, but, asleep or awake, I felt a keen pain that urged me to drink, again and again. The light that came into the scullery was no longer gray, but red. To my disordered imagination, it seemed the color of blood. On the 14th day, I went into the kitchen, and I was surprised to find that the fronds of the red weed had grown right across the hole in the wall, turning the half-light of the place into a crimson-colored obscurity. It was early on the 15th day that I heard a curious, familiar sequence of sounds in the kitchen, and, listening, identified it as the snuffling and scratching of a dog. Going into the kitchen, I saw a dog's nose peering in through a break among the ruddy fronds. This surprised me, and at the scent of me he barked shortly. I thought if I could induce him to come into the place quietly, I should be able, perhaps, to kill and eat him. And in any case, it would be advisable to kill him, lest his actions attracted the attention of the Martians. I crept forward, saying, "Good dog," very softly, but he suddenly withdrew his head and disappeared. I listened. I wasn't deaf, but certainly the pit was still. I heard a sound like the flutter of a bird's wings and a horse croaking, but that was all. For a long while I lay close to the peephole, but not daring to move aside the red plants that obscured it. Once or twice I heard a faint pitter-patter like the feet of the dog going hither and thither on the sand far below me, and there were more bird-like sounds, but that was all. At length, encouraged by the silence, I looked out, except in the corner where a multitude of crows hopped and fought over the skeletons of the dead the Martian had consumed. There wasn't a living thing in the pit. I sat about me, scarcely believing my eyes. All the machinery had gone, save for the big mound of grayish-blue powder in one corner, certain bars of aluminum in another, the black birds, and the skeletons of the killed. The place was merely an empty circular pit in the sand. Slowly, I thrust myself out through the red weed and stood upon the mound of rubble. I could see in my direction, save behind me, to the north, and neither Martians nor sign of Martians were to be seen. The pit dropped sheerly from my feet, but a little way along the rubbish afforded a practicable slope to the summit of the ruins. My chance of escape had come. I began to tremble. I hesitated for some time, and then in a gust of desperate resolution, with a heart that throbbed violently, I scrambled to the top of the mound in which I had been buried so long. I looked about again. To the northward, too, no Martian was visible. When I had last seen this part of Sheen in the daylight, it had been a straggling street of comfortable white and red houses, interspersed with abundant shady trees. Now I stand on a mound of smashed brickwork, clay and gravel, over which spread a multitude of red cactus-shaped plants, knee-high without a solitary terrestrial growth to dispute their footing. The trees near me were dead and brown, but further a network of red threads scaled the still living stems. The neighboring houses had all been wrecked, but none had been burned. Their houses stood, sometimes to the second story, with smashed windows and shattered doors. The red weed grew tumultuously in their roofless rooms. Below me was the great pit, with the crows struggling for its refuse. A number of other birds hopped about among the ruins. Far away I saw a gaunt cat slink crouchingly along a wall, but traces of men there were none. The day seemed, by contrast with my recent confinement, dazzlingly bright, with the sky glowing blue. A gentle breeze swept the red weed that covered every scrap of unoccupied ground, gently swaying. And oh, the sweetness of the air. Chapter 6. The Work of 15 Days. For some time I stood tottering on the mound, regardless of my safety. Within that noisome den from which I had emerged, I had thought with a narrow intensity of only our immediate security. I had not realized what had been happening to the world, had not anticipated the startling vision of unfamiliar things. I expected to see Sheen in ruins. I found about me the landscape, weird and lurid, of another planet. For that moment, I touched an emotion beyond the common range of men, yet one that the poor brutes we dominate know only too well. I felt as a rabbit might feel returning to his burrow, and suddenly confronted by the work of a dozen busy navvies digging the foundations of a house. I felt the first inkling of a thing that presently grew quite clear in my mind, that oppressed me for many days, a sense of dethronement, a persuasion that I was no longer a master, but an animal among the animals, under the Martian heel. With us it would be, as with them, to lurk and watch, to run and hide, the fear and empire of man who had passed away. But so soon as this strangeness had been realized, it passed, and my dominant motive became the hunger for my long and dismal fast. In the direction away from the pit I saw, beyond a red-covered wall, a patch of garden ground unburied. This gave me a hint, and I went in knee-deep, and sometimes neck-deep, in the red weed. The density of the weed gave me a reassuring sense of hiding. The wall was some 6 feet high, and when I attempted to clamber it, I found I could not lift my feet to the crest. So I went along by the side of it, and came to a corner in a rockwork that enabled me to get to the top, and tumble into the garden I coveted. Here I found some young onions, a couple of gladiolus bulbs, and a quantity of immature carrots, all of which I secured and scrambled over a ruined wall, went on my way through the scarlet and crimson trees towards Kew. It was like walking through an avenue of gigantic blood drops, possessed with two ideas: to get food and to limp, as soon and as far as my strength permitted, out of the accursed unearthly region of the pit. Some way farther, in a grassy place, was a group of mushrooms, which I also devoured, and then I came upon a brown sheet of flowing, shallow water where meadows used to be. These fragments of nourishment served only to whet my hunger. At first I was surprised at this flood in a hot, dry summer, but afterwards I discovered that it was caused by the tropical exuberance of the red weed. Directly this extraordinary growth encountered water, it straightway became gigantic and of an unparalleled fecundity. Its seeds were simply poured down into the water of the Wey and the Thames, and its swiftly growing, titanic water fronds speedily choked both those rivers. At Putney, as I afterwards saw, the bridge was almost lost in this tangle of weed, and at Richmond, too, the Thames water poured in a broad and shallow stream across the meadows. I lost my place. The Thames water poured in a broad and shallow stream across the meadows of Hampton and Twickenham. As the water spread, the weed followed them until the ruined villas of the Thames Valley were for a time lost in this red swamp, whose margin I explored, and much of the desolation the Martians had caused was concealed. In the end, the red weed succumbed almost as quickly as it had spread. A cankering disease due to, it is believed, the action of certain bacteria presently seized upon it. Now, by the action of natural selection, all terrestrial plants have acquired a resisting power against bacterial diseases. They never succumb without a severe struggle, but the red weed rotted like a thing already dead. The fronds became bleached, and then shivered and then shriveled and brittle. They broke off at the least touch, and the waters that had stimulated their early growth carried the last vestiges out to sea. My first act on coming to this water was, of course, to slake my thirst. I drank a great deal of it, and, moved by an impulse, gnawed some fronds of the red weed, but they were watery and had a sickly, metallic taste. I found the water was sufficiently shallow for me to wade securely, although the red weed did impede my feet a little, but the flood evidently got deeper towards the river, and I turned back to Mortlake. I managed to make out the road by means of occasional ruins of its villas and fences and lamps, and so presently I got out of this spate and made my way up the hill, going up towards Roehampton, and coming out on Putney Common. Here the scenery changed from the strange and unfamiliar to the wreckage of the familiar. Patches of ground exhibited the devastation of a cyclone, and in a few score yards I would come upon perfectly undisturbed spaces, houses with their blinds trimly drawn and doors closed, as if they had been left for a day by the owners, or as if their inhabitants slept within. The red weed was less abundant. The tall trees along the lane were free from the red creeper. I hunted for food among the trees, finding nothing, and also raided a couple of silent houses, but they had already been broken into and ransacked. I rested for the remainder of the daylight in a shrubbery, being, in my enfeebled condition, too fatigued to push on. All this time I encountered no human beings, and neither signs of Martians. I did see a couple of hungry-looking dogs, but they both hurried circuitously away from the advances I made them. Near Roehampton I'd seen 2 human skeletons. Not bodies, but skeletons, picked clean. And in the wood by me, I found the crushed and scattered bones of several cats and rabbits, and the skull of a sheep. But though I gnawed parts of these in my mouth, there was nothing to be got from them. After sunset, I struggled on the road towards Putney, where I think the heat ray must have been used for some reason. And in the garden beyond Roehampton, I once again got a quantity of immature potatoes, sufficient to stay my hunger. From this garden, one looked down upon Putney and the river. The aspect of the place in the dusk was singularly desolate. Blackened trees, blackened, desolate ruins, and down the hill, the sheets of the flooded river, red tinged with the weed. And overall, silence. It filled me with indescribable terror to think how swiftly that desolating change had come. For a time, I believed that mankind had been swept out of existence, and that I stood here alone, the last man left alive. Hard by the top of Putney Hill, I came upon another skeleton, with the arms dislocated, and removed several yards from the rest of the body. As I proceeded, I became more and more convinced that the extermination of mankind was, save for such stragglers as myself, already accomplished in this part of the world. The Martians, I thought, had gone on and left the country desolated, seeking food elsewhere. Perhaps even now they were destroying Berlin or Paris, or it might be that they'd gone northward. All right, before we begin with Chapter 7, I'm going to run a few small spots, or I'm going to try to. We'll see if I can get things to work. Maybe not. I hate to leave just dead air, but I don't think I can get these spots to run properly. Well, that's annoying. Well, I'll try and fill the at least 26 of the seconds of me getting water with a little spot about the stinger. I shall return with Chapter 7 momentarily.
Hi, my name is Tim Martinez. I'm a senior radio TV major at St. Ambrose University. St. Ambrose has given me every opportunity through hands-on experience that is vital in the radio and TV industry. Working behind the scenes, I've been a director, camera operator, and I've dealt with audio production. In front of the camera, I've anchored SAU Dateline, our weekly St. Ambrose newscast. If radio and TV production is the path you want to take, then come check out everything that SAU TV and KALA Radio has to offer.
All right, let's hope I didn't leave you alone with the silence for too long. Anyway, let's return to the War of the Worlds with Chapter 7, The Man on Putney Hill. I spent that night in the inn that stands at the top of Putney Hill, sleeping in a made bed for the first time since my flight to Leatherhead. Ooh, hi there, creaking sound. I will not tell the needless trouble I had breaking into that house. Afterwards, I found the front room was on the latch, nor how I ransacked every room for food until just on the verge of despair. In what seemed to me to be a servant's bedroom, I found a rat-gnawed crust and 2 tins of pineapple. The place had already been searched and emptied. In the bar, I afterwards found some biscuits and sandwiches that had been overlooked. The sandwiches I couldn't eat, they were too rotten, but the former not only stayed my hunger, but filled my pockets. I lit no lamps, fearing a Martian might come beating that part of London for the food in the night. And before I went to bed, I had an interval of restlessness, and prowled from window to window, peering out for some sign of these monsters. I slept little. As I lay in bed, I found myself thinking consecutively, a thing I do not remember to have done since my last argument with the curate. During all the intervening time, my mental condition had been a hurrying succession of vague emotional states, or a sort of stupid receptivity. But in the night, my brain, reinforced, I suppose, by the food I had eaten, grew clear, and I thought. 3 things struggled for possession of my mind: the killing of the curate, the whereabouts of the Martians, and the possible fate of my wife. The former gave me no sensation of horror or remorse to recall. I saw it simply as a thing done, a memory infinitely disagreeable, but quite without the quality of remorse. I saw myself then as I see myself now, driven step by step towards that hasty blow, the creature of a sequence of accidents leading inevitably to that. I felt no condemnation, yet the memory, static, unprogressive, haunted me. In the silence of that night, with the sense of the nearness of God that sometimes comes into the stillness and the darkness, I stood my trial, my only trial, for that moment of wrath and fear. I retraced every step of our conversation from the moment when I'd first found him crouching beside me, heedless of my thirst, and pointing to the fire and smoke that streamed up from the ruins of Weybridge. We had been incapable of cooperation. Grim chance had taken no heed of that. Had I foreseen, I would have left him at Halliford. But I didn't foresee, and crime is to foresee and do. And I set this down, and I've set all this story down as it was. There were no witnesses. All these things I might have concealed. But I set it down, and the reader must inform his or her judgment as he will. And when, by an effort, I set aside that picture of a prostrate body, I faced the problem of the Martians and the fate of my wife. For the former I had no data. I could imagine 100 things, and so unhappily I could do for the latter as well. And suddenly that night, it became terrible. I found myself sitting up in bed, staring at the dark. I found myself praying that the heat ray might have suddenly and painlessly struck her out of being. Since the night of my return from Leatherhead, I had not prayed. I had uttered prayers, fetish prayers, had prayed as heathens mutter charms when in extremity, but now as I prayed indeed, pleading steadfastly and sanely, face to face with the darkness of God. Strange night. Strangest in this, that as soon as the dawn had come, I, who had talked with God, crept out of the house like a rat leaving its hiding place. A creature scarcely larger, an inferior animal, a thing that, for any passing whim of our masters, might be hunted and killed. Perhaps they also prayed confidently to God. Surely, if we've learned nothing else, this war has taught us pity. Pity for those witless souls who have to suffer our domination. The morning was bright and fine, and the eastern sky glowed pink, and was fretted with little golden clouds. In the road that runs from the top of Putney Hill to Wimbledon was a number of poor vestiges of the panic torrent that must have poured Londonward on the Sunday night after the fighting began. There was a little 2-wheeled cart, inscribed with the name of Thomas Lobb, greengrocer, New Malden, with a smashed wheel and abandoned tin trunk. There was a straw hat, now trampled into the hardened mud, and at the top of the West Hill, a lot of blood-stained glass over the overturned water trough. My movements were languid, my plans of the vaguest. I had the idea of going to Leatherhead, though I knew that there I certainly had the poorest chance of finding my wife. Certainly, unless death had overtaken them suddenly, my cousins and she would have fled there thence. But it seemed to me that I might find or learn whether the Surrey people had fled. I knew I wanted to find my wife, that my heart ached for her in the world of men, but I had no clear idea of how the finding might be done. I was also sharply aware of my intense loneliness. From the corner I went, under a cover of thicket trees and bushes, to the edge of the Wimbledon Common, stretching wide and far. The dark expanse was lit in patches by yellow gorse and broom. There was no red weed to be seen, thankfully, and I prowled, hesitating, on the verge of the open. The sun rose, flooding it all with light and vitality. I came upon a busy swarm of little frogs in a swampy place enjoying the trees. I stopped to look at them, drawing a lesson from their stout resolve to live. And presently, turning suddenly with an odd feeling of being watched, I beheld a crouching figure amid a clump of bushes. I stood regarding it. I made a step towards it, and it rose up and became a man armed with a cutlass. I approached him slowly, and he stood silent and motionless, regarding me. As I drew nearer, I perceived he was dressed in clothes as dusty and filthy as my own. He looked, indeed, as though he'd been dragged through a culvert. Nearer, I distinguished the green slime of the ditches, mixing with the pale drab of dried clay and shiny, coaly patches. His dark hair fell over his eyes, and his face was dark and dirty and sunken, and so at first I didn't recognize him. There was a red cut across the lower part of his face. "Stop," he cried when I was within 10 yards of him, and I stopped. His voice was hoarse. "Where are you coming from?" I thought, surveying him. I come from Mortlake. I was buried near the pit that the Martians made about their cylinder. I have worked my way out and escaped." "There is no food about here," he said. "This is my country. All this hill down to the river, and back to Clapham, and up to the edge of the common. There's only food for one. Which way are you going?" I answered slowly, unsure of myself. I don't know. I've been buried in the ruins of a house 13 or 14 days. I don't know what has happened." He looked at me doubtfully, then started, and looked with a changed expression. I have no wish to stop about here. I'll just go to Leatherhead. My wife is there." He shot out a pointing finger. "It is you, the man from Woking, and weren't you killed at Weybridge?" I recognized him at the same moment. "You're the artillery who came into my garden." Oh yeah. Sorry, I misturned a page. As I was saying, "You're the artilleryman who came into my garden." "Good luck. We're lucky ones. Fancy you." He put out a hand and I took it. "I crawled up a drain, but they didn't kill everyone. And after they went away, I got off towards Walton across the fields. But it's not 16 days altogether, and your hair is gray." He looked over his shoulder suddenly. "Only a rook," he said. "One gets to know that birds have shadows these days. This is a bit open. Let us crawl under those bushes and talk." Have you seen any Martians since you crawled out?" "They've gone away across London. I guess they've got a bigger camp there. Of a night, all over there, Hampstead way, the sky is alive with their lights. It's like a great city, and in the glare you can see them moving. By daylight you can't, but nearer I haven't seen them," he counted on his fingers, 5 days. Then I saw a couple across Hammersmith carrying something big. And the night before last," he stopped and spoke impressively. It was just a matter of lights, but it was something up in the air. I do believe they've built a flying machine and are learning to fly." I stopped on hands and knees, for we had come close to the bushes. "Fly?" "Yes," he said. "Fly." I went on into a little bower and sat down. It's all over with humanity then. If they can do that, they'll simply go around the world. He nodded. They will. But it will relieve things over here a bit. And besides, he looked at me. Aren't you satisfied? It is up with humanity. I am. We're down, we're beat. I stared. Strange as it may seem, I hadn't arrived at this fact. A fact perfectly obvious as soon as he spoke. I still held a vague hope, rather, that I kept a lifelong habit of mind. He repeated his words. We're beat. They carried absolute conviction. It's all over, he said. They've lost just one. And they've made their footing good and crippled the greatest power in the world. They've walked all over us. The death of that one at Weybridge was an accident. And these are only pioneers. They kept on coming. Those green stars, I've seen at least 5 or 6. But I've no doubt they're falling somewhere every night. Nothing to be done. We're under. We're beat. I made him no answer. I sat staring before me, trying in vain to devise some countervailing thought. This isn't a war, said the artilleryman. It never was a war, any more than there's a war between man and ants. Suddenly I recalled the night in the observatory. After the 10th shot, they fired no more. At least until the first cylinder came. How do you know? Said the artilleryman, and I explained. He thought, something's wrong with the gun. What if there is? They'll get it right again, and then even if that's a delay, how can it alter the end? It's just men and ants. There's the ants that build their cities, live their lives, wars, revolutions, until the men want them out of the way, and then they go out of the way. That's what we are now, just ants, only... Yeah? We're eatable ants. We sat, looking at each other. And what will they do with us? That's what I've been thinking. After Weybridge, I went south, thinking. I saw what was up. Most of the people were hard at it, squealing and exciting themselves. But I'm not so fond of squealing. I've been sighted death once or twice. I'm not an ornamental soldier. The best and worth is death. Just death. And it's the man that keeps on thinking comes through. I saw everyone tracking way south. Says food won't last this way. I turned back. I went for the Martians like a sparrow goes for man. All around there. Starving in heaps, bolting, treading on each other. He saw my face and halted awkwardly. No doubt lots who have money have gone away to France, he said. He seemed to hesitate whether to apologize, met my eyes and went on. There's food all about here. Canned things in shops, wines, spirits, mineral waters. The water mains and drains are empty. Well, I was telling you what I was thinking. Here's intelligent things, I says, and it seems they want us for food. First they'll smash us up, ships, machines, guns, all the order and organization. All that'll go, but if we were size of ants, we might pull through. But we're not. It's too bulky to stop. That's the first certainty. I assented, quietly. It is. I've thought it out. Very well then, next. At present, we're caught as we're wanted. A Martian has only to go a few miles to get a crowd on the run. I saw one day out by Wandsworth, picking houses to pieces and routing among the wreckage. But they won't keep on doing that. As soon as they've settled all our guns and ships, and smashed all our railways, and done all the things they're doing over there, they'll begin catching us systematically, picking the best and storing us in cages and things. That'll be what they start doing in a bit. Lord, they haven't even begun on us yet. Don't you see that? Not begun? I exclaimed. Not begun. All that's happened so far is through our not having the sense to keep quiet, worrying them with guns and such foolery, losing our heads and rushing off in crowds. There wasn't any more safety than where we were. They don't want to bother us yet. They're making their things, making all the things they couldn't bring with them, getting things ready for the rest of their people. Very likely that's why the cylinders have stopped for a bit, for fear of hitting those who were there. And instead of rushing about blind on the how or getting dynamite on the chance of busting them up, we gotta fix ourselves up according to the new state of affairs. That's how I figure it. It isn't quite according to what a man wants to do for his species, but it's about the facts point to. And that's the principle I acted upon. Cities, nations, civilization, progress. It's all over. That game's up. We're beat. But if that's so, then what is there to live for? The artilleryman looked at me for a moment. There won't be any blessed concerts for a million years or so. No Royal Academy of the Arts, no nice little feeds at restaurants. If it's amusement you're after, I reckon the game's up. You got any drawing room manners or a dislike to eating peas with a knife or dropping H's, you better chuck 'em anyway, they ain't no further use. You mean? I mean the men that are like me are going on living, for the sake of the breed. I tell you what, I'm grim set on living. If I'm not mistaken, you'll show what insides you've got too before long. We are going to be exterminated. I don't mean to be cawed either. Tamed and flattened those... I don't mean to be tamed or flattened either, for that matter. Bred like a thundering ox. Ugh, fancy those brown creepers. You don't mean to say... I do. I'm going on under their feet. I got it planned. I got it thought out. We men are beat. We don't know enough. We gotta learn before we got a chance. And we gotta live and keep independent while we learn, see? That's what's gotta be done. I stared, astonished and stirred profoundly by the man's resolution. Good God. But you are a man indeed. Suddenly I gripped his hand. Yeah, I've thought it out, he said with his eyes shining. Well, those men who mean to escape their catching must get ready. I'm getting ready myself, mind you. It isn't all of us that are made for wild beasts. That's what it's got to be. That's why I watched you. I had my doubts. You're slender. I don't know that it was you are. Or just how you'd been buried. All these sort of people who lived in these houses, all the little clerks that used to live down that way, they'd be no good. Haven't got any spirit in them. No proud dreams, no proud lusts. And a man who hasn't one or the other, good heavens, what is he but funk and precautions? They just used to skedaddle off to work, hundreds of them, bit of breakfast in hand, running wild, shining to catch their little season ticket train, for fear they'd get dismissed if they didn't, working at businesses they were afraid to take the trouble to understand, skedaddling back for fear. They wouldn't be back in time for dinner, keeping indoors after dinner for fear of the back streets, sleeping with the wives they married, but not because they wanted them, because they had a little bit of money that could make for safety in that one little miserable skedaddle through the world. Lives insured and a bit invested in fear of accidents, and on Sundays, fear of hereafter, as if hell was built for rabbits. Well, the Martians will be a godsend to these. Nice roomy cages, fattening food, careful breeding, no worry. After a week or so after chasing about the fields and land on an empty stomach, they'll come and be right cheerful. They'll be quite glad after that. They wonder what people did before there were Martians to take care of them. And the bar loafers, the mashers, the singers. I can imagine them, he said with a sort of somber gratification. There'll be any amount of sentiment and religion loose among them. There's hundreds of things I've seen with my eyes that I only begin to see clearly these last few days. There's lots who will take things as they are, fat and stupid. And lots will be worried by a sort of feeling that it's all wrong. They ought to be doing something. Now, whenever these things are, so that a lot of people feel they ought to be doing something the weak, and those go weak with a lot of complicated thinking. Always make for some sort of do-nothing religion, very pious and superior, submit to persecution and the will of the Lord. Very likely you've seen the same thing. It's energy in a gale of funk, and you turned clean inside out. Those cages will be full of psalms and hymns and piety, and those of a less simple sort, working a bit of, what is it? Eroticism. He paused for a moment, as I did. Shouldn't have given this guy this gravelly voice, making my throat very upset. Very likely these Martians will make pets of some of them, train them to do tricks. Who knows, maybe get sentimental over the pet boy who grew up and had to be killed. And some, maybe, they'll train to hunt us. No, that's impossible. No person would... What's the good of going on with such lies? Those are men who do it cheerful. It's nonsense to pretend there isn't. And I succumbed to his conviction. After they come after me, Lord, if they come after me, and subsided into a grim meditation. I sat contemplating these things. I could find nothing to bring against his reasoning. In the days before the invasion, no one would have questioned my intellectual superiority to his. I, a professed and recognized writer on philosophical themes, and he a common soldier, and yet he had already formulated a situation that I scarcely realized. What are you doing? What plans have you made? He hesitated. Well, if it's like this, what have we to do? We have to invent a sort of life where man can live and breed and be sufficiently secure to bring the children up. Yeah, wait a bit. I'll make it clearer what I think ought to be done. Tame ones will go like all tame beasts. A few generations will be big, beautiful, rich-blooded, stupid rubbish. The risk is who we keep wild to go savage, degenerate into a sort of big savage rat. You see, how I mean to live is underground. I've been thinking about the drains. Of course, those who don't know drains think horrible things, but under this London are miles and miles, hundreds of miles. A few days' rain and London will empty, leave them sweet and clean. The main drains are big enough and airy enough for everyone. There's cellars, vaults, stores from which bolting passages may be made to the drains. And the railway tunnels and subways, eh? You're getting it now. We can form a band, able-bodied, clear-minded men. Not gonna pick up any rubbish that drifts in. Weaklings go out again. Did you mean me to go? Well, I parlayed, didn't I? We won't quarrel about that. Just go on. Those who stop obey orders. Able-bodied, clean-minded women who we want also. Mothers and teachers. Oh, excuse me. No lackadaisical ladies. No blasted rolling eyes. Can't have any weak or silly. Life is real again, useless and cumbersome, mischievous. They ought to die. They ought to be willing to die. It's a sort of disloyalty, after all, to live and taint the race. They can't be happy. Moreover, dying's none so dreadful. It's the funking that makes it bad. And in all those places we shall gather, our district will be London. We may even be able to keep a watch, run about in the open when the Martians keep away. Play cricket, maybe. That's how we'll save the race. It's possible, but saving the race is nothing in itself. As I say, that's only being rats. It's saving our knowledge and adding to it is the thing. Men like you need to come in. That's where men like you come in. There's books and there's models. We gotta get great safe places down deep, get all the books we can. Not novels and poetry swipes, but ideas. Science books. It's where men like you come in. Gotta go through the British Museum, pick all those books through. Especially to keep up our science. Learn more. We gotta watch the Martians. Some of us have gotta go as spies. When it's all working, perhaps I will. Get caught, I mean. Great thing, we gotta leave the Martians alone. We mustn't even steal. We get in their way, we clear out. We must show them we mean no harm. I know, but they're intelligent things. They won't hunt us down if we have all they want and think they're just harmless vermin. The artilleryman paused and laid a brown hand upon my arm. After all, it may not be so much as we have to learn before. Think about this. 4 or 5 of their fighting machines suddenly starting off, heat rays right and left, and not a Martian in them. Not a Martian in them, but men. Men who've learned the way how. Maybe even in my time, those men. Fancy having one of them lovely things with its heat ray wide and free. Fancy having it in control. What would it matter if you smashed to smithereens at the end of the run after a bust like that? I reckon the Martians will open their beautiful eyes. Can't you see 'em, man? Can't you see 'em hurrying, puffing and blowing and hooting to each other their mechanical affairs? Something out of gear in every case. Swish, bang, rattle, swish. Just as they're fumbling over it, swish comes the heat ray, and behold, man has come back to his own. For a while, the imaginative daring of the artilleryman and the tone of assurance and courage he assumed completely dominated my mind. I believed unhesitatingly both in his forecast of human destiny and in the practicability of his astonishing scheme, and the reader who thinks me susceptible and foolish must contrast his position, reading steadily with all his thoughts about the subject, and mine crouching fearfully in the bushes and listening, distracted by apprehension. We talked in this manner through the early morning time, and later crept out of the bushes, and after scanning the sky for Martians, hurried precipitately to the house on Putney Hill, where he had made his lair. It was the coal cellar of the place, and when I saw the work he had spent a week upon, it was a burrow near scarcely 10 yards long, which he designed to reach the first main drain on Putney Hill, I had my first inkling of the gulf between his dreams and his powers. Such a hole I would have dug in a day. But I believed in him sufficiently to work with him all the morning until past midday at his digging. We had a garden barrow and shot the earth we removed against the kitchen range. We refreshed ourselves with a tin of mock turtle soup and wine from the neighboring pantry. I found a curious relief from the aching strangeness of this world and steady labor. As we worked, I turned this project over in my mind, and presently objections and doubts began to arise, but I worked there all morning, so I was glad to find myself with a purpose again. After working an hour, I began to speculate on the distance we had to go before the cloaca was reached, the chances we had of missing it altogether. My immediate trouble was why should we dig this long tunnel when it was possible to get in the drain at once down one of the manholes and work backwards to the house. It seemed to me, too, that the house was inconveniently chosen and required a needless length of tunnel. And just as I was thinking of these things, the artilleryman stopped digging and looked at me. "We're working well," he said. He put down his spade. "Let us knock off a bit. I think it's time we reconnoitered from the roof of the house." However, I was for going on, and after a little hesitation he resumed his spade, then was suddenly struck by a thought. I stopped, and so did he at once. "Why were you walking at the common?" I said, "instead of being here?" "Taking the air. I was coming back. It's safer by night." "The work?" "Oh, one can't always work." And in a flash I saw the man plain. He hesitated, holding his spade. "We ought to reconnoiter now, because if any come near, they may hear the spades and drop upon us unawares." All right, I gotta know what reconnoiter means. Not plain. Reconnoiter. Reconnoiter. Make a military observation of a region. Duly noted. I was no longer disposed to object. We went together under the roof and stood on a ladder, peeping out the roof door. No Martians were to be seen, and we ventured out on the tiles and slipped down under the shelter of the parapet. From this position, a shrubbery hid the greater portion of Putney, but we could see the river below, a bubbly mass of red weed, and the low parts of Lambeth flooded in red. The red creeper swarmed up the trees about the old palace, and their branches stretched gaunt and dead, and set with shriveled leaves from among its clusters. It was strange how entirely dependent both these things were upon flowing water for their propagation. About us neither had gained a footing. Labradorums, pink mays, snowballs, and trees of arbor vitae rose out of the laurels and the hydrangeas, green and brilliant in the sunlight. Beyond Kensington, dense smoke was rising, and that in a blue haze had hid the northward walls. The artilleryman began to tell me what sort of people who remained in London. "One night last week, some fools got the electric light in order, and there was Regent Street and the circus ablaze, crowded with painted and ragged drunkards, men and women, dancing and shouting till dawn. Men who was there told me. And as the day came, they became aware of a fighting machine standing near Langham, looking down at them. Heaven knows how long he'd been there. Must have given them some of a nasty turn. He came down the road towards them, picked nearly 100 too drunk or frightened to run away. Grotesque gleam of a time no history will ever fully describe. From that, in answer to my questions, he came round to his grandiose plans again. He grew enthusiastic. He talked so eloquently of the possibility of capturing a fighting machine that I honestly more than half believed him again. but now I was beginning to understand something of his quality. I could divine the stress he laid on doing nothing precipitately, and I noted that now there was no great question he was to capture the fight. And I noted that now there was no question he personally was to capture and fight the great machine. After a time, we went down to the cellar. None of us seemed disposed to resume digging, and when he suggested a meal, I was nothing loath. He became suddenly very generous, and when he'd eaten, he went away and returned with some excellent cigars. We lit these, and his optimism glowed. He was inclined to regard my coming as a great occasion. There's some champagne in the cellar. We can dig better on the Thameside Burgundy. No, I'm host today. Champagne, good heavens. We're a heavy enough task before us. Let us take a rest, gather some strength while we can, with these blistered hands. And pursuant to this idea of a holiday, we set upon playing cards after we'd eaten. He taught me euchre, and after dividing London between us, I taking the northern side and he the southern, we played for parish points. Grotesque and foolish as this will seem to the sober reader, it's absolutely true. And what is more remarkable, I found the card game and several others we played extremely interesting. Strange mind of man that, with our species on the edge of extermination or appalling degradation, with no clear prospect before us but the chance of a horrible death, we could sit following the chance of this painted pasteboard and playing the joker with vivid delight. Afterwards, he taught me poker, and I beat him at 3 rough chess games. When dark came, we decided to take the risk and lit a lamp. After an interminable string of games, we supped, and the artilleryman finished the champagne. We went on smoking the cigars, and he was no longer the energetic regenerator of his species I had encountered in the morning. He was still optimistic, but it was a less kinetic, more thoughtful optimism. I remember he wound up with my health, proposed in a speech of small variety and considerable intermittence. I took a cigar and went upstairs to look at the lights, which he'd spoken of, that blazed so greenly along the Highgate hills. Sorry, I'm checking how many chapters are. At first, I stared unintelligently across the London valley. The northern hills were shrouded in darkness, and the fires near Kensington glowed redly. And now and then an orange-red tongue of flame flashed up and vanished in the deep blue night. All the rest of London was black. Then, nearer, I perceived a strange light, a pale purple-violet fluorescent glow quivering under the night breeze. For a space, I couldn't understand it, and then I knew it must be the red weed from which this faint irradiation proceeded. With that realization, my dormant sense of wonder, my sense of the proportion of things, awoke again. I glanced from that to Mars, red and clear, glowing high in the west, and then gazed long and earnestly at the darkness of Hampstead and Highgate. I remained a very long time upon the roof. You must excuse me, I once again misclicked and went forward a chapter. Isn't this everyone's favorite? Now, where were we? Most of the way through this chapter, I'd assume. I remained a very long... Oh, the proportion of things woke again. I glanced from there to Mars, so on and so forth. I remained a very long time upon the roof, wondering at the grotesque changes of the day. I recalled my mental states from the midnight prayer to the foolish card-playing. I had a violent revulsion of feeling. I remember I flung away the cigar with a certain wasteful symbolism. My folly came to me with glaring exaggeration. I seemed a traitor to my wife and my kind. I was filled with remorse. I resolved to leave this strange, undisciplined dreamer of great things to his drinking gluttony, and to go on into London. There, it seemed to me, I had the best chance of learning what the Martians and my fellow men were doing. I was still upon the roof when the late moon rose. Alright, I need to take another moment, unfortunately. So, I'm going to try and run these two. Okay, we are on chapter 8. So we have 2 chapters left. I was, in fact, correct in saying that there were 10 chapters. So I will be back after a moment. I need to take a short break, rest my throat after all that gravel from the soldier. I shall return, though. Enjoy the 2 fillers, and also maybe a song might come up. I'm not quite sure.
You are listening to The Stinger on KALA HD3.
All right. So that was a staring contest by Mates of State. Sorry about that. I needed to get up and stretch my legs for a little bit, use the restroom. You know, it has been 3 hours. So anyway, let's finish up War of the Worlds. Chapter 8, Dead London. After I had parted from the artillerymen, I went down to the hill and by the high street across the bridge to Fulham. The redweed was tumultuous at that time and nearly choked the bridge's roadway, but its fronds were already whitened in patches by the spreading disease that presently removed it so swiftly. At the corner of the lane that runs to Putney Bridge Station, I found a man lying. He was black as a sweep with the black dust, alive but helplessly and speechlessly drunk. I could get nothing from him but curses and furious lunges at my head. I think I should have stayed by him, but for the brutal expression of his face. There was black dust along the roadway from the bridge onwards, and it grew thicker in Fulham. The streets were horribly quiet. I got food, sour, hard, and moldy, but quite edible, in a baker's shop there. Some way towards Walham Green, the streets became clear of powder, and I passed a white terrace of houses on fire. The noise of the burning was an absolute relief. Going on towards Brompton, the streets were quiet again. Here I came once more upon the black powder in the streets, and upon dead bodies. I saw altogether about a dozen in the length of the Fulham Road. They had been dead many days, so that I hurried quickly past them. The black powder covered them over and softened their outlines. 1 or 2 had been disturbed by dogs. Where there was no black powder, it was curiously like a Sunday in the city, with the closed shops, houses locked up and blinds drawn, the desertion and stillness. In some places, plunderers had been at work, but rarely at other than the provision and wine shops. A jeweler's window had been broken open in one place, but apparently the thief had been disturbed, and a number of gold chains and a watch lay scattered on the pavement. I didn't trouble to touch them. Farther on was a tattered woman in a heap on a doorstep. The head that hung over her knee was gnashed and bled down her rusty brown dress. A smashed meganium of champagne formed a pool across the pavement. She seemed asleep, but she was dead. The further I penetrated into London, the profounder grew the stillness. But it was not so much the stillness of death, it was the stillness of suspense, of expectation. At any time, the destruction that had already singed the northwestern borders of the metropolis and had annihilated Ealing and Kilburn might strike among these houses and leave them smoking ruins. It was a city condemned and derelict. In South Kensington, the streets were clear of dead and of black powder. It was near South Kensington that I first heard the howling. It crept almost imperceptibly along my senses. It was a sobbing alteration of 2 notes. Oola, 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 keeping on perpetually. When I passed streets that ran northward, it grew in volume, and houses and buildings seemed to deaden and cut it off again. It came in a full time down Exhibition Road. I stopped, starting towards Kensington Gardens. Wondering at the strange, remote wailing. It was as if that mighty desert of houses had found a voice for its fear and solitude. Oola, 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 wailed that superhuman note, great waves of sound sweeping down the road between the tall buildings on each side. I turned northwards, marveling towards the iron gates of Hyde Park. I had half a mind to break into the National History Museum and find my way up to the summits of the towers in order to see across the park. But I decided to keep to the ground, where quick hiding was possible, and so on went up Exhibition Road. All the large mansions on each side of the road were empty and still, and my footsteps echoed against the sides of the houses. At a top, near the park gate, I came upon a strange sight, a bus overturned and the skeleton of a horse picked clean. I puzzled over this for a time, and then went onto the bridge over the Serpentine. The voice grew stronger and stronger, though I could see nothing above the housetops on the north side of the park, save a haze of smoke to the northwest. Oola, 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 cried the voice, coming, as it seemed to me, from the district about Regent's Park. That desolating cry had worked upon my mind. The mood that had sustained me passed, and the wailing took possession of me. I now found I was intensely weary, footsore, and once again hungry and thirsty. It was already past noon. Why was I wandering alone in this city of the dead? Why was I all alone when London was lying in this state in its black shroud? I felt intolerably lonely. My mind ran on old friends that I'd forgotten for years. I thought of the poisons in the chemist shops, of the liquor in the wine merchant's store. I recalled the two sodden creatures of despair who, as far as I knew, shared the city with myself. I came into Oxford Street by the Marble Arch, and here again were black powder in several bodies, and an evil, ominous smell from the gratings of the cellars in some of the houses. I grew very thirsty after the heat of my long walk. With infinite trouble, I managed to break into a public house and get food and drink. I was weary after eating, and went into the parlor behind the bar, and slept on a black horsehair sofa I found there. I woke to find that dismal howling still in my ears. Oola, 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 oola. It was now dusk, and after I had routed out some biscuits and a cheese in the bar, there was a meat safe, but it contained nothing but maggots, I wandered on through the silent residential squares to Baker Street, as Portman Square is the only one I can name, and so came out upon Regent's Park. And as I emerged from the top of Baker Street, I saw far away over the trees, in the clearness of the sunset, the hood of the Martian giant from which this howling proceeded. I was not terrified. I came upon him as if it were a matter of course. I watched him for some time, but he didn't move. He appeared to just be standing and yelling, for no reason that I could discover. I tried to formulate a plan of action. That perpetual sound of oola, 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 oola confused my mind. Perhaps I was too tired to be very fearful. Certainly I was more curious to know the reason of this monotonous crying than afraid. I turned back away from the park and struck into Park Road, intending to skirt the park, went along under the shelter of terraces, and got a view of this stationary, howling Martian from the direction of St. John's Wood. A couple of 100 yards out of Baker Street, I heard a yelping chorus and saw, first, a dog with a piece of putrescent red meat in his jaws coming headlong towards me, and then a pack of starving mongrels in pursuit of him. He made a wide curve to avoid me, as though he feared I might prove a fresh competitor. As the yelping died away down the silent road, the wailing sound of oola, 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 oola once again reasserted itself. I came upon the wrecked handling machine halfway to the St. John's Wood station. At first I thought a house had fallen along the road. It was only as I clambered among the ruins that I saw, with a start, this mechanical Samson lying with its tentacles bent and smashed and twisted among the ruins it had made. The forepart was shattered. It seemed as if it had been driven blindly straight at the house, and had been overwhelmed in its overthrow. It seemed to me that this might have happened by a handling machine escaping from the guidance of its Martian. I could not clamber among the ruins to see it, and the twilight was now so far advanced that the blood with which its seat was smeared and the gnawed gristle of the Martian which the dogs had left were invisible to me. Wondering still more at all that I had seen, I pushed on toward Primrose Hill. Far away, through a gap in the trees, I saw a second Martian, as motionless as the first, standing in the park towards the zoological gardens, and silent this time. A little beyond the ruins about the smashed handling machine, I came upon the red weed again, and found the Regent's Canal, a spongy mass of dark red vegetation. As I crossed the bridge, the sound of oola, 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 oola ceased. It was as if it were cut off. The silence came like a thunderclap. The dusky houses about me stood faint and tall and dim. The trees towards the park were glowing black. All about me the red weed clambered among the ruins, writhing to get above me in the dimness. Night, the mother of fear and mystery, was coming upon me, but while that voice sounded the solitude, the desolation, it had been endurable. By virtue of it, London still seemed alive, and the sense of life about me, it had upheld me. Then suddenly a change and a passing of something, I knew not what, and then a stillness that could be felt. Nothing but this gaunt quiet. London about me gazed at me spectrally. The windows in the white houses were like eye sockets of skulls. About me, my imagination found 1,000 noiseless enemies moving. Terror seized me, a horror of temerity. In front of me, the road became pitchy black as though it was tarred, and I saw a contorted shape lying across the pathway. I could not bring myself to go on. I turned down St. John's Wood Road and ran headlong from this unendurable stillness towards Kilburn. I hid from the night and the silence until long after midnight in a cabman's shelter in Harrow Road. But before dawn my courage returned, and while the stars were still in the sky, I turned once more towards Regent Park. I missed my way among the streets and presently saw down a long avenue, in the half-light of the early dawn, the curve of Primrose Hill. On the summit, towering up to the fading stars, was the third Martian, erect and motionless like the others. An insane resolve possessed me. I would die and end it, and I would save myself even the trouble of killing myself. I marched on recklessly towards this Titan, and then as I grew nearer and the light grew, I saw a multitude of black birds were circling and clustering about the hood. At that, my heart gave a bound, and I began running along the road. I hurried through the red weed that choked St. Edmund's Terrace. I waded breast high through a torrent of water that was rushing down from the waterworks towards Albert Road, and emerged upon the grass before the rising of the sun. Great mounds had been heaped about the crest of the hill, making a huge redoubt of it. This was the final and largest place the Martians had made, and from behind these heaps rose a thin smoke against the sky. Against that sky, an eager dog ran and disappeared. The thought that had flashed in my mind grew real and incredible. I felt no fear, only a wild, trembling exultation as I ran up the hill towards the motionless monster. Out of his hood hang lank shreds of brown at which the hungry birds pecked and tore. In another moment I had scrambled up the earthen rampart and stood upon its crest, and the interior of the redoubt was below me. A mighty space it was, with gigantic machines here and there within it, huge mounds of material and strange shelter places. And scattered about it, some in their overturned war machines, some in their rigid handling machines, and a dozen of them stark and silent laid in a row were the Martians, dead, slain by the putrefactive and diseased bacteria against which their systems were unprepared. Slain as the red weed was being slain after all man's devices had failed, by the humblest things that God in his wisdom has put upon the earth. For so it might have come about, as indeed I and many men might have foreseen, had not terror and disaster blinded our mind. These germs of disease have taken their toll on humanity since the beginning of things, taken toll on our pre-human ancestors since life began here, for that matter. But by virtue of the natural selection of our kind, we've developed resisting power. To no germs do we succumb without a struggle, and to many Those that cause putrefaction in dead matter, for instance, our living frames are altogether immune. But there are no bacteria in Mars, and directly these invaders arrived, they drank and they fed, directly as well. Our microscopic allies beginning to work in their overthrow. Already, when I watched them, they were irretrievably doomed, dying and rotting even as they went to and fro. It was inevitable. By the toll of 1 billion deaths, man has become the birthright of his earth, and it is this against all comers. It would still be his if the Martians were 10 times as mighty as they are, for neither do men live nor die in vain. Here and there they were scattered, nearly 50 altogether, in the great gulf they had made, overtaken by a death that must have seemed to them as incomprehensible as any death could be. To me also at the time the death was incomprehensible, however. All I knew was that these things had been alive and so terrible to men were dead. For a moment I believed that the destruction of Sennacherib had been repeated, that God had repented, that the angel of death had slain them in the night. I stood staring into the pit, and my heart lightened gloriously, even as the rising sun struck the world to fire about me with its rays. The pit was still in darkness, their mighty engines so great and wonderful in their power and complexity, so unearthly in their tortuous forms, rose weird and vague and strange out of the shadows towards the light. A multitude of dogs I could hear fought over the bodies that lay darkly on the dip of the pit, far below me, and across the pit on its farther lip, flat and vast and strange, lay the great flying machine with which they had been experimenting upon our denser atmosphere when decay and death arrested them. Death had come not a day too soon. At the sound of cawing overhead, I looked up at the huge flying machine that would fly no more forever, at the battered red shreds of flesh that dripped down the overturned seats and the summit of Primrose Hill. I turned and looked down the slope of the hill to where, now enhaloed in birds, stood those other 2 Martians that I'd seen overnight, just as death had overtaken them. The one had died, even as it was crying to its companions. Perhaps it was the last to die, and its voice had gone on perpetually until the force of its machinery was exhausted. They glittered now, harmless tripod towers of shining metal, in the brightness of the rising sun. All about the pit, and saved as by a miracle from everlasting destruction, stretched the great mother of cities. Those who have only seen London veiled in her somber robes of smoke can scarcely imagine the naked clearness and beauty of the silent wilderness of houses. Eastward over the blackened ruins of Albert Terrace and the splintered spire of the church, the sun blazed, dazzling in a clear sky, and here and there some facet of the great wilderness of roofs caught the light and glared with a white intensity. Northward were Kilburn and Hampstead, blue and crowded with houses. Westward the great city was dimmed, and southward, beyond the Martians, the green waves of Regent Park, the Langham Hotel, the dome of Albert Hall, the Imperial Institute, and the giant mansions of Brompton Road came out clear and little in the sunrise, the jagged ruins of Westminster rising hazily beyond. Far and away in blue were the Surrey Hills, and the towers of the Crystal Palace glittered like 2 silver rods. The dome of St. Paul's was dark against the sunrise, and injured, I saw it for the first time, by a huge gaping cavity on its western side. And I looked at this huge expanse of houses and factories and churches, silent and abandoned, and I thought of those multitudinous hopes and efforts, the innumerable hosts of lives that had gone to build this human reef, and of the swift and ruthless destruction that had hung over it all, when I realized that the shadow had been rolled back, and that men might still live in the streets, and this dear vast city of mine could once more be alive and powerful. I felt a wave of emotion that was near akin to tears. The torment was over. Even that day, the healing would begin. The survivors of the people, scattered over the country, leaderless, lawless, foodless, like sheep without a shepherd, the thousands who had fled by sea would begin to return. The pulse of life, growing stronger and stronger, would beat again in the empty streets and pour across the vacant squares. Whatever destruction was done, the hand of the destroyer was stayed. All the gaunt wrecks, the blackened skeletons of houses that stared so dismally at the sunlit grass of the hill, would presently be echoing with the hammers of the restorers and ringing with the tapping of their trowels. At the thought, I extended my hands towards the sky and began thanking God. In a year, thought I. In a year. With my overwhelming force came the thought of myself, of my wife, and the old life of hope and tender helpfulness that had eased forever. Chapter 9. Wreckage. And now comes the strangest thing in my story. Yet perhaps it's not altogether strange. I remember, clearly and coldly and vividly, all I did that day until the time I stood weeping and praising God on the summit of Primrose Hill. And then I forget. Of the next 3 days I know nothing. I've learned since, though, that so far from my being the first discoverer of the Martian overthrow, several such wanderers as myself had already discovered this on the previous night. One man, the first, had gone to St. Martin's de la Grande, and while I sheltered in the cabman's hut, had contrived to telegraph to Paris. Thence the joyful news had flashed all over the world. 1,000 cities, chilled by ghastly apprehensions, suddenly flashed into frantic illuminations. They knew of it in Dublin, Edinburgh, Manchester, Birmingham, at the time when I stood on the verge of the pit. Already men, weeping with joy as I have heard, shouting and staying their work to shake hands and shout, were making up trains, even as near as Crewe, to descend upon London. The church bells that had ceased a fortnight since suddenly caught the news, until all England was bell-ringing. Men on cycles, lean-faced, unkempt, scorched along every county line, shouting of unhoped deliverance, shouting to gaunt, staring figures of despair. And for the food! Across the Channel, across the Irish Sea, across the Atlantic, corn, bread, and meat were tearing to our relief. All the shipping in the world seemed to be going Londonward in those days. But of all this I have no memory. I drifted, a demented man. I found myself in the house of a kindly people who had found me on the third day wandering, weeping, and raving through the streets of St. John's Wood. They've told me that since I was singing some insane doggerel about the last man left alive. Hurrah, hurrah, the last man left alive. Troubled as they were with their own affairs, these people, whose name, much as I would like to express my gratitude to them, I may not even give here, nevertheless cumbered themselves with me, sheltered me, and protected me from myself. Apparently they had learned something of my story during my days of my lapse. Very gently, when my mind was assured again, did they break to me what they had learned at the fate of the Leatherhead. 2 days after I was imprisoned, it had been destroyed, with every soul in it, by a Martian. He swept it out of existence, it seemed, without any provocation, as a boy might crush an anthill in the mere wantonness of power. I was a lonely man, and they were very kind to me. I was a lonely man and a sad one, and they bore with me. I remained with them for 4 days after I recovered. All that time I felt a vague, gnawing craving to go once more on whatever remained of my little life that seemed so happy and bright in my past. It was a mere hopeless desire to feast upon my misery. They dissuaded me. They did all they could to divert me from this morbidity. But at last I could resist the impulse no longer, and promising faithfully to return to them, and parting, I will confess, from these 4-day friends with tears, I went out again into the streets that had already been so dark and strange and empty. Already they were busy with returning people. In places there were even shops open. I saw a drinking fountain running water. I remember how mockingly bright the day seemed as I went back on my melancholy pilgrimage to the little house at Woking, how busy the streets and vivid the moving life about me. So many people were abroad everywhere, busied in 1,000 activities, that it seemed incredible that any great proportion of the population could have been slain. But then I noticed how yellow were the skins of the people I met, how shaggy the hair of the men, how large and bright their eyes, and that every other man still wore his dirty rags. Their faces still seemed all with one of two expressions, a leaping exultation and energy or a grim resolution. Save for the expression of the faces, London remained a city of tramps. The vestries were indiscriminately distributing bread sent to us by the French government. The ribs of few horses showed dismally. Haggard special constables with white badges stood at the corner of every street. I saw little of the mischief wrought by the Martians until I reached Wilmington Street, and there I saw the red weed clambering over the buttresses at Waterloo Bridge. At the corner of the bridge, too, I saw one of the common contrasts of that grotesque time, a sheet of paper flaunting against a thicket of the red weed, transfixed by a stick that kept it in place. It was the placard of the first newspaper to resume publication, the Daily Mail. I bought a copy for a blackened shilling I had found in my pocket. Most of it was in blank, but the solitary compositor who did the thing had amused himself by making a grotesque scheme of advertisement stereo on the back page. The matter he had printed was emotional. The news organization had not as yet found its way back. I learned nothing fresh except that already in 1 week the examination of the Martian mechanisms had yielded astonishing results. Among other things, this article assured me what I did not believe at the time, that the secret of flying was discovered. At Waterloo, I found the free trains that were taking people to their homes. The first rush was already over. There were few people in the train, and I was in no mood for casual conversation. I got a compartment to myself and sat with folded arms, looking grayly at the sunlit devastation that flowed past the windows. And just outside the terminus, the train jolted over temporary rails, and on either side of the railway the houses were blackened ruins. To Clapham Junction, the face of London was grimy with the powder of the black smoke, in spite of 2 days of thunderstorm and rain, and at Clapham Junction the line had been wrecked again. There were hundreds of out-of-work clerks and shopmen working side by side with the customary navies, and we were jolted over a hasty relaying. All down the line from there, the aspect of the country was gaunt and unfamiliar. Wimbledon particularly had suffered. Walton, by virtue of its unburned pine woods, seemed the least heard of any place along the line. The Wandle, the Mole, every little stream was a heaped mass of red weed in appearance between butcher's meat and pickled cabbage. The Surrey pine woods were too dry, however, for the festoons of the red climber. Beyond Wimbledon, within sight of the line, in certain nursery grounds, were the heaped masses of earth about the sixth cylinder. A number of people were standing about it, and some sappers were busy in the midst of it. Over it flaunted a Union Jack, flapping cheerfully in the morning breeze. The nursery grounds were everywhere crimson with the weed, a wide expanse of livid color cut with purple shadows, and very painful to the eye. One's gaze went with infinite relief from the scorched grays and sullen reds of the foreground to the blue-green softness of the eastward hills. The line on the London side of the Woking station was still undergoing repair, so I descended at Byfleet station and took the road to Maybury, past the place where I and the artilleryman had talked to the hussars, and on to the spot where the Martian had appeared to me in the thunderstorm. Here, moved by curiosity, I turned aside to find, among a tangle of red fronds, the warped and broken dog-cart, with the whitened bones of a horse scattered and gnawed. For a time I stood regarding these vestiges. Then I returned through the pine wood, neck-high with red weed here and there, to find the landlord of the spotted dog had already found burial, and so came home past the College Arms. A man standing at an open cottage door greeted me by name as I passed. I looked at my house with a quick flash of hope that faded immediately. The door had been forced. It was unfast and opening slowly as I approached. It slammed again. The curtains of my study fluttered out the open window from which I and the artilleryman had watched the dawn. No one had closed it since. The smashed bushes were just as I had left them nearly 4 weeks ago. I stumbled into the hall, and the house felt empty. The stair carpet was ruffled and discolored where I had crouched, soaked to the skin from the thunderstorm of the night, of the catastrophe. Our muddy footsteps, I saw, still went up the stairs. I followed them to my study, and found lying on my writing table still, with the selenite paperweight upon it, the sheet of work I'd left on the afternoon of the opening of the cylinder. For a space I stood reading over my abandoned arguments. It was a paper on the probable development of moral ideas with the development of the civilizing process, and the last sentence was the opening of a prophecy. In about 200 years, I had written, we may expect... The sentence ended abruptly. I remembered my inability to fix my mind that morning, scarcely a month gone by, and how I'd broken off to get my daily chronicle from the newsboy. I remembered how I went down to the Golden Gate as he came along, and how I listened to his odd story of men from Mars. I came down and went into the dining room. There were the mutton and bread, both far gone now in decay, and a beer bottle overturned, just as the artilleryman and I had left them. My home was desolate. I perceived the folly of a faint hope I cherished so long. And then a strange thing occurred. "It's no use," said a voice. "The house is deserted. No one's been here these 10 days. Don't stay here to torment yourself. No one escaped but you." I was startled. Had I spoken my thought aloud? I turned, and the French window was open behind me. I made a step to it and stood, looking out. And there, amazed and afraid, even as I stood, amazed and afraid, were my cousin and my wife. My wife, white and tearless. She gave a faint cry. I knew." She put her hand to her throat and swayed. I made a step forward and caught her in my arms. And now comes the ending. Chapter 10, the epilogue. I cannot but regret, now that I am concluding my story, how little I am able to contribute to the discussion of the many debatable questions which are still unsettled. In one respect, I shall certainly provoke criticism. My particular province is speculative philosophy. My knowledge of comparative physiology, is confined to a book or two, but it seems to me that Carver's suggestions as to the reason of the rapid death of the Martians is so probable as to be regarded as almost a proven conclusion. I've assumed that in the body of my narrative. At any rate, in all the bodies of the Martians that were examined after the war, no bacteria, except those already known as terrestrial species, were found. That they didn't bury any of their dead, and the reckless slaughter they perpetrated, point also to an entire ignorance of the putrefactive process. But probable as this seems, it's by no means a proven conclusion. Neither is the composition of the black smoke known, which the Martians used with such deadly effect, and the generator of the heat ray remains a puzzle. The terrible disasters of the Ealing and South Kensington laboratories have disinclined analysts for further investigations upon the latter. Spectrum analysis of the black powder points unmistakably to the presence of an unknown element with a brilliant group of 3 lines in the green, and it's possible that it combines with argon to form a compound which acts at once with deadly effect upon some constituent in the blood. But such unproven speculations will scarcely be of interest to the general reader, to whom this story is addressed, after all. None of the brown scum that drifted down the Thames after the destruction of Shepperton was examined at the time, and now none's forthcoming. The results of an anatomical examination of the Martians, so far as the prowling dogs had left such an examination possible, I've already given. But everyone's familiar with the magnificent and almost complete specimen in spirits at the National History Museum, and the countless drawings that have been made from it. And beyond that, the interest of their physiology and structure is purely scientific. A question of graver and universal interest is the possibility from another attack from the Martians. I don't think that nearly enough attention is being given to this aspect of the matter. At the present, Mars is in conjunction, but with every return to opposition, I, for one, anticipate a renewal of their adventure. In any case, we should be prepared. It seems to me it should be possible to define the position of the gun from which the shots are discharged, to keep a sustained watch on this part of the planet, and to anticipate the arrival of the next attack. In that case, the cylinder might be destroyed with dynamite or artillery before it would be sufficiently cool for the Martians to emerge, or they might be butchered by the means of guns so soon as the screw opened. It seems to me they've lost a vast advantage in the failure of their first surprise. Probably they see it in the same light. Lessing has excellent reasons for supposing that the Martians have actually succeeded in effecting a landing on the planet Venus. 7 months ago now, Venus and Mars were in alignment with the Sun. That is to say, Mars was in opposition from the point of view of an observer on Venus. Subsequently, a peculiar, luminous and sinuous marking appeared on the unillumined half of the inner planet, and almost simultaneously, a faint dark mark of similar sinuous character was detected by a photograph of the Martian disk. One needs to see drawings of these appearances in order to appreciate fully their remarkable resemblance in character. At any rate, whether we expect another invasion or not, Our views of the human future must be greatly modified by these events. We've learned now that we cannot regard this planet as being fenced in and a secure, unabiding place for man. We can never anticipate the unseen good or evil that may come upon us suddenly out of space. It may be that in the larger design of the universe, this invasion from Mars is not without its ultimate benefit for men. It has robbed us of that serene confidence in the future, which is the most fruitful source of decadence. This gift to human science that is the gifts to human science that it has brought are enormous, and it has done much to promote the conception of the commonwealth of mankind. It may be that across the immensity of space, the Martians have watched the fate of these pioneers of theirs and learned their lesson, and that on the planet Venus they may have found a secure settlement. Be that as it may, however, for many years there will certainly be no relaxation of the eager scrutiny of the Martian disk, and those fiery darts of the sky, the shooting stars, will bring with them, as they fall, an unavoidable apprehension to all the sons of men. The broadening of man's views that has resulted can scarcely be exaggerated. Before the cylinder fell, there was a general persuasion that through all the deep of space no life existed beyond the petty surface of our minute sphere. Now we can see further. If the Martians can reach Venus, there's no reason to suppose the thing is impossible for men, and when the slow cooling of the sun makes this earth uninhabitable, as at last it must do, there may be that thread of life that has begun here that will stream out and caught our sister planet within its toils. Dim and wonderful is the vision I've conjured up in my mind of life spreading slowly from this little seed bed of the solar system throughout the inanimate vastness of sidereal space. But that's a remote dream. It may be, on the other hand, that the destructions of the Martians is only a reprieve. To them, and not to us, perhaps the future is ordained. I must confess the stress and anger of the time have left an abiding sense of doubt and insecurity in my mind. I sit in my study reading by lamplight, and suddenly I see again the healing valley below, set with writhing flames, and feel the house behind and about me empty and desolate. I go out into the Byfleet Road, and vehicles pass me, a butcher boy in his cart, a cab full of visitors, a workman on his bicycle, children going to school, and suddenly they become vague and unreal, and I hurry again with the artillerymen through the hot, brooding silence. Of a night I see the black powder darkening the go-out silent streets, and the contorted bodies shrouded in that lair. They rise upon me, tattered and dog-bitten. They gibber and grow fiercer, paler, uglier, mad distortions of humanity at last. And I wake, cold and wretched, in the darkness of the night. I go to London, and I see the busy multitudes in Fleet Street and the Strand, and it comes across my mind that they are but ghosts of the past, haunting the streets that I've seen, silent and wretched, going to and fro, phantasms in a dead city, the mockery of life in a galvanized body. And strange, too, is it to stand on Primrose Hill, as I did but a day before writing this last chapter, to see the great evidence of houses, blue through the haze of the smoke and mist, vanishing at last into the vague lower sky, to see people walking to and fro among the flower beds on the hill, to see the sightseers about the Martian machine that stands here still, to hear the tumult of playing children, and to recall the time when I saw it all bright and clear-cut, hard and silent, under the dawn of that last great day. And the strangest of it all is to hold my wife's hand again, and to think that I have counted her, and that she has counted me, among the dead. So, that was War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. Next week, we're going to start something that I think is very clever. So, I have to read public domain books for legal reasons. But I found a science fiction serial magazine that's been out long enough that it's in the public domain. So, what this means is that we're going to be reading, starting next week, a science fiction serial magazine, hopefully a month and an issue a week. They were monthly issues. I can look at the length of the... Oh, of course. Yeah, I'm looking at the length of the books now, and we'll probably at least do absolutely for sure do one every 2 weeks, if not one a week, depending on how fast I read. So next week, tune in for Astounding Stories of Super-Science, January 1930. Thanks for listening to Paper Cuts, everybody. And here comes some music. Turn Around by Mikkel Cronin, I think, is what's coming up next.